everybody. So this is Marianne Moenraj and Benjamin Rosenbaum. Moenraj and Rosenbaum are humans. And today we were thinking that we would talk about the publishing industry, how we got into writing and publishing, and maybe some helpful details for new writers, although Ben and I have been writing for a long time and things have changed tremendously in 25 or so years. So I don't know, Ben, do you want to start? Like, how did you start writing, and then how did you move to well, maybe I want to publish this stuff, and where were you living, and when did you start sending things out, all of that?
So there's an interesting story. I'll tell a prequel to that, which
Hmm.
about or perhaps the intro to how did I want to write. So I think I wrote a lot as a kid, and I ended up with a very well developed identity as a writer. I sort of was going to be a writer. It's kind of a vague. I didn't know what that exactly looked like, and I think it was sort of grand and modernist. I would be in a garret and produce.
Mm.
The muse would inform me, and then I would produce masterpieces, and then I don't know, die of cholera. Something, but but and I think I went off to college with that ambition very not 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 just the ambition, but I had been I'd attached a lot of ego investment to it by that point.
Mm.
I was sort of known as the writer in my circle of friends, and I think at that point, when I was a teenager, I occasionally sent things off. I once sent a finished story off to the New Yorker, and they actually referred me to some other. They're like, "Why don't you try submitting it there?"
Oh,
More.
that's so nice.
And I think that was kind of bewildering because I was sort of
Hmm.
just playing at it at like 15 or
Right.
something. I didn't actually expect to get a real response. And I think I got very. The other thing is that this was the late 80s, and we were precocious in various ways, and we kind of invented blogging without computers. We all had notebooks that we carried around in my little crowd, and we would write our daily thoughts on them, and then we would hand them around, and everyone would comment in the margins. It was like
uh,
paper blogging. Anyway, and that meant that I didn't actually ever have to really finish anything or polish it. I sort of had an instant feedback of people admiring my sentences. And I was good at writing sentences, although I didn't know how to revise or finish anything, or the very
hmm.
first part where you write some good sentences, I got good at. But I think I kind of got, my reach exceeded my grasp. I had this grant, and even by the end of high school, and certainly by the beginning of college, it became more and more of, I had this sense that I was doomed because I had these flaws which I didn't really know how to work on. I didn't know how to. I had so much investment in them. I felt so strongly about that everyone was counting on me to be a writer by this point, I declared it, that I didn't have very much room to fail. And so and also I was at a fancy schmancy college, and in the late 80s there was not a lot of, it wasn't, I don't know if not genre is exactly the right set of categorizations, but certainly the kind of things that I took creative writing classes, but it was the height of sad white people at dinner parties fiction,
Sure.
minimalist, nuanced explorations of tiny uh, um, nuances of feeling in contemporary settings, and ideally sad. Someone should probably have cancer. And I wasn't really interested in um, writing, or I had no idea how to write that.
Hmm.
And so I began to feel really sad about it, and I gave up writing my sophomore year of college the way that alcoholics give up drink. I mean, I swore off it. And the precipitating incident for my abandoning writing and burning all my writing bridges was that my girlfriend at the time was a poet, and a good poet. And not only was she a good poet, but she could revise. She would take the thing that she had
Hmm.
written and just say, oh, that doesn't work, and slash it out and put something in. And this seemed to me to be like a kind of a monstrous miracle. How could she bear to do this? It just, I was completely aware that I should be able to do that and that I couldn't. And so I actually felt kind of bitterly resentful. I mean, not the kind of useful envy where you're goaded to top your friends. Sometimes you're like, oh, that was so good, I got to do something better. It was more like I wished she were worse, and that was then I had to pull the then I had to pull the red cord. I was like, I'm not signed up. Like, I'm signed up to be. I kind of had this sense, like, well, I have this tragic destiny. To like, oh, he would have been great if only he could have, I don't know, learned to revise or whatever. But like, that was, I was okay with being a failure, but I wasn't okay with being an asshole. Like at this point, I was
Yeah.
becoming like truly bitter, and I was like, that's I'm done. I'm done. It's not like I'm not going to be. I don't. I'm not interested in being terrible. So I was like, I guess I'm not writing. So I stopped, and the experience of stopping was very interesting because I'd already developed the habit of seeing everything that happened to me as like material that would someday be significant. Like there are two tracks running in your head, like you're breaking up.
I literally have done that, right? I've been in the
Yeah,
middle of a breakup and taking notes
right.
because, like, I was brokenhearted. I said something, I phrased it really well, and I was like, I gotta remember this, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's this dual consciousness, and it kind of justifies everything in your life. And so actually, I think it was kind of healthy to like at 20 be presented with this ultimatum from the universe. It's like, no, you're only living once. Like everything just has to be worth it for its own sake. Like you're not, none of this is material. That was like a bracing, hard reality. But I stuck to it. I stayed the course. I didn't write for like 7 years until I fell off the wagon, and then I started writing again one side, and I think that was tied up with my sense of what was I capital letters going to be. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? What would I be when I grew up? What would my purpose, my also my career, but also my self definition? And so I like lived until my late 20s without that as a self definition. And I like was a programmer who like learned a bunch of languages and lived a bunch of places. And I don't know, like I'd made a life, which was okay.
Can I
Yeah.
pause you here? Because
Mm,
I want you to continue this, but
yeah.
I think this is a good place to intersect, like, where
Hmm.
my early writing
Yeah.
stuff started.
Yeah. Do go.
And I also want to like put out a quote. So this, I
Hmm.
always think of this quote from Ira Glass. I don't know if you've run across it. It's a little long, but I think it's worthwhile. Glass is, he's on NPR. He's fabulous.
I'm a fan.
Um, yeah. So nobody tells this to people who are beginners. I wish someone told me. All of us who do creative work, we get into it because we have good taste, but there's this gap. For the first couple of years you make stuff, it's just not that good. It's trying to be good, it has potential, but it's not. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, is still killer, and your taste is why your work disappoints you. A lot of people never get past this phase, they quit. Most people I know who do interesting creative work went through years of this. We know our work doesn't have this special thing that we wanted to have. We all go through this. And if you're just starting out or you're still in this phase, you got to know it's normal. And the most important thing you can do is do a lot of work. Put
Hmm.
yourself on a deadline so that every week you will finish one story. It's only by going through a volume of work that you will close that gap and your work will be as good as your ambitions. And I took longer to figure out how to do this than anyone I've ever met. It's going to take a while. It's normal to take a while. You just got to fight your way through. So I
Yeah.
give this to my students when I remember, and I think it's a super helpful framing. Um,
Yeah.
my path was slightly different
I should say
because,
before we get off the quote, I should say in science fiction that's often referred to as the million words of crap.
yes,
You
yeah.
have to write a million words of crap first.
Yeah, but I think the bit that he puts out about it being about you have
Yeah,
good taste
you
and
have taste, exactly.
yeah, you
It's
know what it
particularly painful for you to write the
yeah,
million words of crap if you're the person who, yeah, I
who
agree.
really cares about what the beautiful thing looks
Yeah.
like, should look like,
There's a
right?
there's a similar post. It's in the context of game design by Vincent Baker, one of the really interesting tabletop game designers. Who Vincent and McGay Baker designed Apocalypse World, which sort of launched a million games. About like where there's a graph of like your
Mhm.
not a micro level, not just this first phase at the beginning of your career, but like even
Yeah,
later, like how you you learn how to do you attain a certain level of mastery, and then so your level of mastery at execution uh, goes somewhere where breaks through so that you are excited about what you've done, and
mhm,
then naturally what then happens is that leads to your developing, as it were, even better taste, or even more distinctive to you taste, or like even more like specific
yeah,
ambition. And then you so it's not just the one big clump at the beginning, but it's like a constant
right.
cycle of like exhilaration and depression or frustration.
Well, and this
you
is
know
where, like, imposter syndrome apparently is supposed to get worse the further you go in your career
yeah,
because
yeah.
you become more and more aware of just how you understand just how good the really good stuff is and what went into that. Anyway, so I didn't hit all of that as a wall early on. I had kind of maybe the opposite problem in some ways, in that I had easy success early. And that, I think, ties into the sort of like the issues that bright kids tend to have, right?
Mhm.
Like, I was the kid who got A's without trying. My daughter is currently the kid who gets A's without trying. My son, who has ADHD, is not.
Mhm.
He has a much more, I've forgotten the word, but it like, it comes and goes, right? Like, there are parts of school that come very easily to him and other parts that are very difficult.
Yeah.
Um, but the one typical classic thing that happens with bright kids who do well with school is that they're great until they hit the first barrier, and then they just fall off a cliff because they
Yep.
have no training in how to work through that. And I think, to some extent, that sounds a little to me like what you were saying about
Yeah.
not knowing how to revise. But
Yeah, I
I
think
guess
that's
I
what
was able.
happened in college, where I reached a point where, like, just the lines being clever wasn't cutting it, either for me
So
or.
I could write. So when I first started writing, I was writing poetry initially, and I bought a book. Oh, now I'm going to blank on the name of it. The Poets Market. This was like the
Oh yeah.
basic resource back in the day. There was the
Yeah.
Writers Market and the Poets Market and the Children's Writer Market, or something
Mhm.
like that.
Mhm. That's
You
right.
could go to the library and get these big fat books that were full of resources, magazine listings, like anthology listings, like, write to this person, and here is the, and it had like a sample of a cover letter in it, and so on. So I
Yeah.
must have been in early college, maybe high school, when I think high school, when I started sending these things out, and sending poetry out. And one of the things about that, so when you're sending things out, there's, right, this hierarchy of, like, here are the top places that are going to be, like, the New Yorker, very hard to get into. Here's the mid range. Here's the very lower things. And I just wanted to be published at
Mhm.
15, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't care where I was published. I just wanted to be in print. And so um, I kind of targeted to, so I wrote a poem, like, about fishing or something, and, like, sent it to Fly Fisherman magazine, and they printed
Mhm.
it, like,
Mhm. Sure.
um, so, like, I wasn't aiming for the New Yorker. And so half the things I sent out that year got published. I probably had like 20 poem publications that year.
Wow.
Um, they were all tiny markets that got very few submissions for the most part, but it gave me this huge injection of self-confidence,
Mhm.
which was great for an early career writer, right?
Yeah.
It really insulated me a little from all the rejections that would come later.
Yeah.
And then the the sorry the and I knew nothing, right? Like, so there's this thing called the National Library of Poetry, I think is the name of it, which is a big scam. But
Uh-huh.
I didn't know it was a scam. So when they sent a letter to my dad saying,
Yeah.
like, your daughter has been selected for the National Library of Poetry, and
Right.
we would like to
Right.
publish two of her poems, and would you like to buy two copies of the
Mhm.
hardbound volume at
Mhm.
$50 each? My dad was like, sure. And
Right.
and her poem, like, fire burned onto a piece of wood to hang on your wall, and he
Uh-huh.
went for that too. So that's hanging in my dad's office wall.
Nice.
So yeah, yeah, yeah. So National Library Poetry, big scam. But this is
Yeah. Yeah.
the, like, we were really proud of it. It's like, like
Sure.
when you get the letter from Who's Who, like, you
Yeah.
don't realize that it's a scam to sell books, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
and make the money. So I wrote poetry, then I started writing fiction. And a similar thing happened with the fiction, where I think I sent out 25, 30 stories.
I, you just cut out. I can't hear you.
Hang on, I think I hit a button. Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yes. Now I can hear you.
Yep. Sorry. I hit a button on my headset. So I sent out like 25 or 30 stories that first year, and like half of them got published. And by that point, I was in college, and the stories I were writing, things had changed a little bit, because by that point, I was writing sex stories for the most part. Uh, so it was a completely different set of markets. Yeah, and I don't know, maybe we'll come back to that. But I would say I was in the same place where, like, my first drafts of stories, even at 20, were pretty clean, right? And so if your aspirations were not very high and you just
Yeah.
wanted, like, a readable story, I could sit down and write you a readable story in a couple hours, and then that could be published. I didn't really have any understanding how to get from there to making the story actually good and
Mhm.
able to compete at the higher level markets. Um, so that, like I got published in places where it was relatively easy to get published for a long time.
Yeah.
So it always makes me like wonder when I go look at like in academia, you have the CV, like unlike a resume, which is supposed to be one page, a CV is supposed to be as long as you can make it, right? So, like, you put every single thing on there that you've
Uh-huh.
ever done, anything
Yeah.
that might count as a publication.
Huh.
But it's sort of goofy in creative writing because we can like crank out lots of like
Sure.
poem, short story publications as opposed to like a
Yeah.
critic who has to like spend 6 months doing, their research in order to write one little article. So,
Right.
um, I end up I end up now like I mostly drop all that early stuff off of here because off there because it yes, it was published and it was probably important to me as a young writer to get
Mhm.
published. I'm sure it
Yeah.
was, in fact, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I'm not actually so proud of those publications
Well,
looking
it's
back.
that's there's the technical term is juvenilia.
Juvenilia, but a lot of people's juvenilia doesn't get published, right? And I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah. Sure.
I was sort of like I got lucky, and I was sort of at this sort of intersection of subject matter and whatever else, and maybe the immigrant perspective was, bringing something unusual, and so for whatever reason, right? Okay, I'm
Also,
handing it back
fly
to you.
fishing
So,
journal.
so you, yes, so you quit writing,
Yeah,
and
so
then what
on that
happened?
oh, but on that note, like in terms of I think it's probably worth breaking down like there are a lot it sounds like there's a lot of similarities and differences, but like also what skill sets I was lacking is interesting. Like so one thing is my ambitions were pretty grandiose and very fuzzy. Like I don't know, the
Mm.
New Yorker was what my mom read. So I didn't and I think I had and a lot of my problem was internal self critic. Like it's precisely the gap of taste that you were quoting Ira Glass about. That I was very dissatisfied with whatever I would produce. Like even before
Mm.
and it got worse because in the beginning I was actually writing when I was in eighth grade. I was like writing full stories, which were kind of it had interesting ideas. They're kind of fun to reread. And then by the time I graduated high school, I could not even like after 2 pages in, I'd be like, this is I'd be overwhelmed by the oppression of how what the gap was between what I was writing and what I wanted to write.
Yeah, and
Um,
so we talk about the internal editor in class a
yeah.
lot, and one thing that is maybe useful to people to think about is when you're originally drafting, you're in that creative generative phase.
Hmm.
You generally want to turn off your internal editor if at all
Yeah.
possible,
Yeah. I had
right?
no
And
idea
just
how to do
be in
that.
that production phase. Yeah,
And
but
also, I think it's
I think
easier said than done.
people don't know it's a goal. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, like I think
Sure.
it's helpful to
Sure.
like frame that, and easier
Yeah. I
said than
think
done.
that's
I
true.
mean, I think like the
Oh, well,
classic writers, some of them like turn to alcohol and so on to help them,
right.
you
Right.
know.
I mean,
Um,
I think that I mean to be fair, I also think that is true. I did not know. I don't think I did know it was a goal, and maybe
yeah,
Natalie Goldberg's writing down the bones would have helped. Maybe
yeah,
something that was very directed on like keep your hand moving, don't think too much.
right.
But because I was trying to create great art like
Hmm.
5 stories in, so um which is not bad. It's not bad to be ambitious, but I do think it's modal. And being aware of that gap is very crucial. But um, also, I think another really important piece is I had no idea how to. What's interesting is I kind of had a community in high school of like the people who were just handing each other snippets of things, but I'd also lost that community by going away to college, and I didn't really have and I don't think that oddly, even though the hype around the American university experience is it's precisely designed for like I don't know shape young minds in communion, but I don't think it was a very productive place for me at a fancy schmancy
Hmm.
school to create a real kind of community around that. You know what I mean? Like not me
Hmm.
doing it. And my vision of a writer was very much like this vision of sort of isolation where the muse hands you, from like it is revealed to you your inner truth that is particularly idiosyncratically yours. And you just have to write, you just have to sit down at the page and like write all the words of that
Hmm.
express your inner essence. And I did not know how to do that. And I didn't think of it as a messy, collaborative, interconnected, interdependent process, um, anyway, but I
I mean,
think
it
largely,
doesn't have to be collaborative, right? I mean, I want
I
to tease
don't.
that
When
apart a
I
little
say,
bit.
when I say collaborative, I don't mean literally like I have done collaborations with people where literally like I
Right.
run 250 lines and I send it to them, but that's not really what I mean. What I mean is, first of all, lots. I mean, for me at least, I am now, I am now not quite as bothered if the first draft. I know that the first draft is crap, and I know that
Mhm.
the third draft after I do 2 revisions, or the fifth draft after I do 4 revisions, is still crap, except now I can't see how it's crap. And I know that I have like a network of people I depend on to then do the next step, which is telling me what's crap about it. You know what I mean? Not everybody may
I
work
know
that
what you
way.
mean, but I wanna yeah, like, I wanna push back a little bit against that realization, or I don't know, like, I have my so I am very praise seeking, right? And approval
Mm,
seeking, right? So
yeah,
I love that kind of thing. I
yeah,
love anytime I write something,
right,
like I could not keep a journal and keep it up until it was a public journal, right?
right,
And
right,
so
right, right.
I thrive on the feedback. I love it. It keeps me going. I love the praise. And even I'll take the criticism because that was gonna like then I can use it to generate more praise, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
so all of that works for me, except that sometimes it doesn't. And I
hmm
think
Sure.
Rilke has the poet Rilke has this book, Letters to a Young Poet,
Yes.
and I often hand the first essay in it out to my students because he talks about turning away from
hmm
the importance and necessity of turning away from audience
hmm
and all of that
Oh,
feedback and
sure.
whatever else, and kind of going into yourself. So I sort of
Oh,
want to highlight that for anyone listening,
I.
like it can be as productive, more productive, depending on like kind of where you are, depending on the project. It's very like there's some projects where I really do want and need a lot of feedback and I find it really helpful. And there are other projects or even other stages in the project or what I need to do is to like be alone in the woods for 2 weeks and
Sure.
like let all the other voices drop away.
Sure,
Right.
of course.
So
Yeah. No, absolutely.
um
I mean, I mean, yes, I mean, I have that too. I think I'm very much like, I think we're both very praise seeking, or, harmony seeking, or whatever, connection seeking, all those things. I think that it was hard to learn. I mean, that was part of my problem, was I was in a bath of like praise and audience and attention without ever having to do the hard work. And it is 100% true about me that if I show, I mean, you sometimes, like, I'm sometimes on mailing lists or something where there are projects where you're just like writing 500 words and blasting them out to 10 people immediately. I absolutely would never finish anything. Like, I would never
yeah.
finish a story if I have to. But I'm also an extrovert and praise seeking and so on. And so it is an act of the will not to show it until the third draft. When I say by the third draft I don't know what it's crap and that's when I show it, I mean I had to suck it up and endure 6 months of not showing it to people, knowing that showing it to people would kill the project.
Yeah, and I'm still really bad at that. I have a lot of trouble with it. And I don't so I'm a little torn on this because so I write right now. One of the things I work on is wildcards, and which is edited by George R. R. Martin, and it's collaborative. And the way the process works is that we have to pitch to him. So
hmm
I've just this past week finished doing pitches for the next 3 books, and he gives us a very loose framework and then we're supposed to come up with an idea and send him a pitch, and I tend to write like a page of like, here's this character, I think this is what the story is going to be like, blah 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 blah. um his He's always frustrated with me that I send him so little, and we
uh-huh.
we just had a like back and forth exchange about this because as he said, like some of the people sending him pitches, they
hmm
write out full scenes, they write out a big chunk of a story and send it to him, and so he has a really good sense of what it might look like,
Yep.
and then they have to be prepared to have him tell them, yeah, I need you to change this character's superpower and this and make
hmm
them a woman and whatever, like like change everything. So there's a I'm trying to I think I get parsimonious with my
hmm
words sometimes, and I think for a long time, and I get maybe lazy is not quite the right word. Every time I say lazy, everyone yells at me. So fine, I'm not lazy. I admit
Efficient.
I admit
Efficient.
that well, yeah, and maybe
And
that's
perhaps
what it is.
protective.
It's just like I'm trying these days, I'm trying to be more profuse. I don't
Mm.
know, generative with like,
Prolific.
in prolific, instead of like being like, okay, I'm gonna like sit down and get this clean version
hmm
and not
hmm
show it to anyone
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
months and whatever. Instead, I'm gonna churn out a bunch of stuff and not be too attached to it.
Yeah. No,
And
me too. I mean, that's a
be
project
willing
of
to
mine
throw
too.
it out entirely. So like like it's the flip side of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with what you're talking about. It's just like,
I mean, I think I think they're both true, and I think I mean, I don't think I don't think the right answer is like attention or no attention, or help or no help, or
mhm,
collaboration, no collaboration. But it's knowing what it does. Like attention can be both vital, like attention, critique, feedback, someone else seeing it, depending on the stage and the project and the person and so on, can be like totally destructive or absolutely invaluable. I think what I mean though is less about, in terms of what I mean about what I didn't know at 20 that led me to stop writing, it's less about um, the process. Like, there was certainly a lot I didn't know about the process, and I had to develop my own, because I think everybody is vastly different about this, my own standards for when to close the door and when to open the door. When to be
mhm,
alone with the thing and not have my head cluttered with everybody else's ideas. Because part of it's maybe instructive to think about, why does it kill it if people see it too early? It kills it because, for one thing, then I've already gotten the like excited buzz of like communicating the story. Like,
mhm,
that's what I think Octavia Butler said about why she didn't write. She didn't write a full outline. She would just write a sentence about the end, a sentence containing the protagonist, the conflict, and the end of the story, and then that was all she would allow herself to write beforehand. Because if she wrote a whole uh,
yeah,
thing, she didn't need to write the book. And I sort of feel like if I let someone see it, I'm like, yay, that's done. I can move on. Like, I got that across. I'm delaying the gratification. That's part of it. Another part of it is that their ideas are simply confusing. Even if I haven't managed to say what I wanted to say yet, and I'm still struggling to say it, the danger isn't that they'll criticize it. The danger is that they'll say things that I like, that will then derail me. And I have like five. I was just managing to pull the three things together that I wanted to do. Now there are six things.
yeah,
And then there's also the problem that, and I think this is the Rilke thing that you were saying, that like maybe this is sort of about intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. If I stray from what it's actually trying to be, to getting the emotional need met of like making people happy, I'm likely to be seduced by their ideas, or I don't know, discouraged by their criticism or whatever. If I haven't attained a certain degree of, if it hasn't gotten a certain wholeness, right?
mhm,
But for me, it's also really crucial, once it has attained that wholeness, to uh, to have other eyes on it, because I don't really know what I've written, right? It's only really, very often, I don't even really know what I've written until long after it's been published, when people tell me what they read. Because writing is like half, when you write something, you did half the work. The other half of the work occurs in the reader's mind.
mhm,
You only it's like, you have written a script. The director and the actors are inside the person's head. Like, you don't know what they're turning the screenplay into until, because they're going to shoot it and act in it in their mind when they read prose, right? So in that sense, it's and very often there are like, in fact, the way people read it is vastly different from the way I meant it, which is like really useful data. Indispensable. Like, I can't really, like, I don't know. So in that sense, I say, but I guess the other thing is just the sort of idea that I didn't have a community. And there, I'm not talking about like collaboration in the sense of like every word. Like, even if I never got critiques before publication, and it only was people, a community of people that read each other's stuff once it was done, it still felt, I didn't understand how vital it was for there to be the, socially and in terms of what it's about, for there to be the shared excitement of people engaged in a similar pursuit and discourse. I mean, also creatively, like to be asking a set of questions and to be reacting to each other's answers to those
I mean,
questions.
Clarion
Yeah,
was like, it made me giddy, right?
yeah,
Like, it was such a heady
yeah,
brew to be in
yeah,
this space for 6 weeks with 17 people who cared as much as you did about
yeah.
this
Right.
this work, right? And were immersed in it. So anyway, I may be jumping ahead though. So when did you find this community again, or and was that like what led you to start submitting stories or writing again,
Well, the
or
funny thing is, what led me to start writing again, and I think this is this is the other point I want to make about the timing of it, is that when I was saying, oh, I had become a computer programmer, and I learned all these languages. Like like the part of my brain that wanted to write, as soon as I stopped writing, for the next few years, I learned Italian, Hebrew, and German. And then as soon as I stopped writing again, I stopped. I also had teach yourself Arabic and
Mm,
Sanskrit, and it was this whole activity, which as soon as I stopped writing again, all that
just
like
stopped.
yeah, it's like it literally was like I was doing that with that part of my brain, and then once the writing was available again, my brain was like, oh, good, well, now we can get back to the main course. um but
I'll side note, this is
yeah.
just funny. I had a friend in high school who could speak 11 languages fluently,
Hmm.
and she I don't know if she ended up doing it, but she had a very clear goal that she wanted to work at the UN.
Hmm.
So she had kind of set this up, but one thing she said was that after the seventh language, it got much easier. You
Oh
could
yeah,
just
sure.
then start adding them on, picking them
Right.
up really quickly. And I
I
was like,
heard
"Don't you
that.
get confused?" And she's like, "No, no." And I was like,
Not at
"All
that point,
right,
maybe. I mean,
maybe not at
certainly
that point,
by two
right?"
or
So
three,
anyway,
I think your second and third language tend to compete for space in your brain for a while. But um
anyway, going back.
uh
So,
yeah. So it's also funny because when I say learned, it's like, well, I learned I could get around in Hebrew. I
yeah,
couldn't read the newspaper. Anyway, so
conversant.
yeah, I mean, I got the third grade was the level
Hmm.
at the Kita Gimel. Anyway, so the what was I going to say? So the now I've got derailed. Okay, so when I went back to writing, I think part of what happened was that part of what was in my way had been, it's when I say, all right, we're going to edit this part out. Now I will resume saying actual sentences. When I said earlier that it's easier said than done to turn the editor off, I mean, I think
Hmm.
in part it was that I didn't know that you were supposed to. But I think also I don't know if I had the emotional wherewithal to do so. Because part of the thing that allows you to turn the editor off is trusting the process. If you have some kind of hope that you can tell yourself that it's not going to be crap forever, you could stop worrying about whether it's crap now. And so there's a way in which um, I had attained enough of a self outside of writing that it was safe to go back to writing. It was not
Hmm.
going to be like the end of me. You know what I mean? The year that I started writing again was basically I got engaged, and I sort of had professional stability. Like I was like, okay, I'm just a person now. I could live a happy life, married to Esther, being a computer programmer. If that was what was on my tombstone, I'd be okay. Like that'd be okay. Like the bottom was no longer like there will be despair and suffering because I will have failed at my one true. It's like but at the same time, there was this part of my heart that was desolate, where I had abandoned this, absolutely crucial part of my, dream for myself. And the thing that brought me back to it, I mean, it was a couple of things, but one of the main things was I went to work I moved back to where I had grown up for other reasons, and was working at some other place. And then a bunch of old friends from high school we started a company together. Or I went to join a company that a couple of my friends from high school, one from high school and one from college, had started. Um, and uh, and then we hired a bunch of other people who we know. It became this nucleus of this our old getting the old gang back together. It was like the movie where you get the old gang back together for one more mission. Anyway, and we made a game. Like it was a game company. We
Hmm.
made an online um, fantasy game, like a sort of Magic the Gathering meets Warcraft, back in the mid '90s. So like very early online gaming. Um, and it was super fun. It's like sort of a
Hmm.
dream job. And I was with all these old friends, and I started taking over more and more of the writing. We didn't actually know how to run a game company.
Hmm.
So we were
Sure.
we had all been out in Silicon Valley, and like one of the reasons this company ultimately fell apart was because we didn't really know how to structure a game company, and it was sort of structured like a Silicon Valley company. And so, we had programmers and artists and stuff, but there wasn't actually writers on staff. We were just all making it up as we went, or game designers. Like we were all
I
doing
mean,
that.
I would say this is like an ongoing difficulty with game design and game companies
Yeah.
that for at least a decade or more, narrative design has been, devalued, not seen as important, and it's only I think very recently that people have started taking it seriously and thinking like, well, of course you need to like have a lead narrative designer
Mhm.
and you have to
Yeah,
pay them appropriately and so on and
yeah,
so forth, right?
yeah.
Like that's kind of new to gaming as a concept generally. So maybe don't beat yourselves up too much
Well, I
about
don't. I actually, I think it
right.
was. I
So
think it was
yeah,
very. I mean, I think it was very fruitful. I mean, when I say I don't, when I say we didn't know how to run a company, I mean, the company failed. But I think what we did was very interesting in part because we didn't even know what rules we were breaking. Like, which is often true if you're sort of things from the margins of. We weren't in the center of the game industry. We were sort of like some weird little thing in the margins, and that's often, a lot of the best games broke all the rules. I mean, like the success of Minecraft is very interesting because if you look at
yeah,
like what the game industry thought a game should be at the time that Minecraft debuted, it was definitely like subscription model, amazing graphics, very structured narrative, everything that Minecraft is not. And because Minecraft was
right.
just some random dudes in Sweden who didn't know what they were doing, that's why it's amazing. And so, I don't know. So it was sort of outsider art in that sense. So, which is not to say, I mean, that people should be professional and narrative design is important and so on. But the fact that we were the Bad News Bears was not necessarily a bad thing. Um, anyway, I ended up doing a lot of the writing, like the bulk of the writing. It was a funny medium because it wasn't a video game with cutscenes and scripts and actors and stuff. It was like Magic the Gathering, so there were cards. So what I was writing was basically flavor text, which is essentially I was writing like
Hmm.
like 50-word short stories
Right.
on each card. But then, of course, they connected to each other. So it was like an anthology of 50-word short stories. It would like make references to each other and to the whole world. And
Hmm.
and then there was also sort of other stuff that came out of it. Um, anyway, it was super fun and super exciting. And my boss, who I had hired to be my boss because I was director of development and I wanted to code more, so I hired Howard to be my boss. And he at one point, came to me and was like, "What are you doing here? Why aren't you, basically like sort of, why aren't you doing writing, for a living?" And I think both of us were very naive about what that meant, but
Hmm.
in terms of what
Sure.
writing for a living meant. But he was he was like sort of that was interesting, and he not being one of the guys who grew up with me, the other one's like, of course Ben is the writer, but then one of my one of my best friends, Jamie, uh, who was running the company. I also had this sort of moment on a flight back from E3 where he was like, I always thought you'd go back to writing. Like, I don't know what
Hmm.
happened to that." And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. That's silly. And then I burst out crying. So, it was like and I think I sort of got to the point where I trusted enough to try to reawaken this abandoned dream. And the thing is that because it was no longer like I had to be like this was my grand destiny and I had to be, whatever. I First of all, I could be playful. I could just do
Hmm.
it for fun. And I found that what I gravitated toward, I think in college I was reading, I don't know, Borges and Kundera and like I was, sort of imagining
Hmm.
myself as some kind of austere European intellectual or something. And what I gravitated to when I started writing again at 27 was like, oh, well, Robert Silverberg's column in the back of like in the Asimov's and FNSF, which was like,
Hmm.
these like stories, which were not, it wasn't that I loved those stories less, but my vision of a writer had been like this sort of very grand, august, at the center of the hegemony vision. And I was like, this actually sounds like fun. Like, not just the
Yeah.
content, not just dragons and spaceships, but like the life of like I'm banging out words on a typewriter and sending them off to the publisher, like as opposed to like I am Nobel laureate whatever.
It's very interesting. I mean, like this is jumping ahead, but when my serious novel crashed and burned with
Hmm.
HarperCollins and got canceled, I went into a depression about writing for a year or so. And the only way I like brought myself back was by saying like I'm going to do something super light, super fun. I'm going to write an erotic space opera.
Hmm.
I'm going to kickstart it. The stakes are going to be incredibly
Yeah,
low. And then I ended up writing about the Sri Lankan war. Like the
right.
seriousness came back.
Knocked back in.
But
Yes.
first I had to give myself permission to
Yes.
play again and like
Yes.
to so there was not so it wouldn't be so terrifying, right?
and
To
and And what I found about my writing in general is when I am like, now I'm going to tackle a serious, deep theme. This will
yeah.
be about, grief and whatever. Then I'm paralyzed. And when I'm like, wouldn't it be cool if there was like a person stitched together out of all kinds of arms and legs of other people? And then they were like, I don't know, it just comes up with a wacky idea. Inevitably, it will be a story about like grief and fatherhood, and
Right.
I don't know. Of course it's going to end up being a meditation on, but it's like my like thematically rich brain is like a shy cat hiding under the couch. You know what I mean? I have to go if I'm like peering under the couch with the flashlight, like come on out. It's like not going to move. If I go, or like a shy toddler hiding behind, somebody's leg, if I go play with blocks in the middle of the room, eventually the toddler begins to creep out and come over, and
Yeah.
eventually there will be all kinds of theme. But like I kind of like it's much more
Yeah.
productive for me to be like, this'll be wacky, and
Yeah.
and just the more playful it is, the better it ends up, the deeper the product ends up being, the less I'm invested in it being, a grand
I
statement
don't
on.
So I don't know if you found this, but like when we do critique at the sort of like, I teach introduction to fiction writing, right? So like a basic beginner class, and we teach craft pretty explicitly in my classes, right? So we'll do plot and theme and plot and setting and voice and point of view and all of that kind of stuff. And there's a sort of a process whereby I would, like it's like a toolbox, and
Mhm.
once you start using these tools, and paying attention to them, you're clunky with them for a while,
Yeah.
right? Because you're paying attention to it. If you keep and even things that used to be easy for you get harder for a
Hmm.
bit, and then but if you keep with it, eventually you end up with a higher level of skill, right? So,
Yeah.
but what we don't start with theme
Hmm.
because I think for the similar to what you're saying is that if you try to write a story about a theme, it's very hard to do that well. And what usually happens is um, we draft our first stories, and then I actually have the whole class um, do sort of group critique of not critique, but like a conversation about like what
Hmm.
are the themes you see
Yeah.
in this person's
Yeah.
story, right? And pull them out so that everyone is able to leave that class with like, oh, here are the themes in my story. I
Hmm.
didn't know I had themes,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Sometimes, and then you take that into revision, and
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
then like when you sit down to revise and you know what the themes are, then you can
Yep.
take some of that random stuff before maybe doesn't serve your theme so well,
Hmm.
and you can substitute in different random stuff that's,
Right.
more directly supporting what you want to do with the story. Does
Yeah,
that make
that's
sense?
that's how I think of it. I think insofar as I think
Yeah.
thinking explicitly about theme is useful. I mean, there's obviously always exceptions to any rule, and I mean, I'm not saying there have been times when like for whatever reason I've had enough slack that some like inquiry into theme has sparked some interesting story idea. So I'm not saying it's an
Sure.
absolute rule, but in general, I do think that like I think of it as a third draft tool in a way. You know what I mean? Like in a way, it's like get the thing going because and I think the reason is because most of what we have to say that's useful thematically is unconscious. It's
Mhm.
not really like it's not. I mean, if we already knew it, we'd already know it. So
Yeah.
it's like what actually is potent is when we don't know yet what we need to say. And so I think in some ways it's like, yeah, if at all, like once the story is already working as a story, to go back and be like, oh, it's about this,
Mhm.
is like, yeah, often that's a very useful moment where then you can hone and balance and think about how to bring that out and pump that up and make that the center of the story.
Yeah.
I mean, and sometimes it's only after you published it, like years later. You know what I mean? Like literally, you don't even know what it's about until later. And sometimes that's a good thing. Like
Yeah.
some of the themes surviving the inquiry of your conscious mind, like making it past, not actually ever being on purpose revised into the
Yeah.
spotlight
Yeah.
is probably a good thing. But yeah, I very regularly also that's one of the specific things about genre, about writing using the science fiction and fantasy tool of like distancing by having a fantastical scenario in which the thing is taking place, is that it allows that self-hiding so that you write a story about, I mean, the story that I wrote, um, Start the Clock, that we talked about one other time, where
Mhm.
about the children who don't grow up, people who are adults, they're like in their 40s, but they have 9-year-old bodies because the whole world's like biological development was arrested by a virus, so they're 9 for 30 years. Like they're house hunting, and like I think only certainly in revisions, like not when I first, but like at some point I was like, oh, this is all about like
Yeah.
moving back to America and all the, there's like things that had actually happened in my life. But like, had I tried to write them about them directly, they would have been much clunkier. I'm sure
Yeah,
literary writers.
I've attended panels where
Yeah.
they're discussing my work, and I'm like,
Oh
I
my
did
God.
not consciously
Right.
put that in there,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it actually makes sense, and maybe my unconscious was that smart. I hope so, right?
Yeah.
Like, and if
Yeah.
not, you found it in there anyway. Good,
It is
So
now. Like, I mean, that's my
yeah,
my
that's
attitude
right.
toward that is generally like people are like, "Is this what it means?" I'm like, "Well, it is now."
Yeah.
Yeah, you win.
Someone found an entire plot thing that, like, there was one of my stories in Bodies in Motion, and has this girl who is a college student who's pregnant and deciding whether or not to have an abortion, and she goes to her aunt at the end, and her aunt helps her, but I that someone came up to me recently. This is like more than a decade after the story was published, right? And said, "So the way you ended that story, it seemed like maybe the aunt ended up taking the baby and adopting it."
Oh, wow.
And I was like, you know what?
Of course
That
she
was not
did.
what I intended. I intended that she had an abortion. However, I think
Yeah.
that's a great
Right.
possibility, and
Right.
I'm now, like, retroactively
Yeah.
revising it to be like, it could be either of those 2
Yeah. Yeah.
things,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
like,
But now it's an
totally
ambiguous
possible.
ending. Yeah.
So, and that makes a lot of
Huh.
sense in the story and whatever. Anyway, it was a weird moment. I was like, at the time, I thought I was writing a story about abortion, so, like, that possibility hadn't even occurred to me,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
And,
Right.
um, I
Yeah.
don't know.
Because we don't know what, and I think it's true generally in life. We don't know what we're doing. Like all right, the conscious
Yeah.
mind, the consciousness is a little flashlight that's like
Mhm.
moving around, focusing on little sections. The brain is doing stuff all the time. All this processing is happening, and the conscious mind is like a little flashlight shining on one piece of it at a time, which is easy to observe because that phenomenon where like you can't think of something and then you go talk about something else and then the idea occurs to you. Like
Yeah.
your brain has been trying to figure that out the whole time. Like your brain is doing all this stuff that you don't know. It's not
Yeah.
it sounds so we were used to thinking of ourselves as these sort of, a single discursive thread of logic as if we were a narration in a book. And so it seems fantastical when authors are like, "Oh, my characters just did this. I don't even know why," or "Oh, like I don't even know what my book contains." It sounds like we're being precious and self-congratulatory and making it seem more mystical than it is. But honestly, that's just how brains work. That's not anything
Yeah, I mean, I do
positive.
think, like, it doesn't I feel like that doesn't serve the conversation. So, like, the artists,
Yeah.
had this sort of tradition of the muses, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
inspired you, and, like, you look at, like, earlier artistic tradition, and there was a lot of discussion of that kind of thing,
Mhm.
right? The inspiration. And then I think that was so fuzzy and romantic and whatever else, right, in the sense of the romantics and so on, that it I ended up sort of like dismissing it all,
Mhm.
right? And I think that maybe cost me some time and
Mhm.
some artistic development as a
Mhm.
result,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Because it's not that there is some spiritual muse inspiring you. It's not that it's coming to you out of the ether, right?
Right.
It is that your unconscious is more complex and smarter than your consciousness,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, when you sit down and you start writing something and it just flows and everything is locking together beautifully and better than your conscious mind could have come up with, it's not that you didn't do the work, right? It's
Mhm.
just that you did it in the shower. You did it, like, like,
Right.
the work has been happening as you're driving, commuting back and forth, listening to NPR for the last
Mhm.
month, and all of that is pouring
Mhm.
into, this mesh. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
have a
you're
good
letting
metaphor
it
for it,
you're
right?
you're I mean, I actually, I mean, that's why, yeah, like I think some of those older descriptions, and they originally, the literal idea of the muse, I mean, is really a religious idea, and it originally comes from a time when uh, the religious consciousness had to do with, that people people there was a long period where people assumed the gods were talking to them. Like that wasn't like even a special, like magical heroic thing. It was just kind of an every, like, why wouldn't they be? You know what I mean? Like, and
Yeah.
it would, and I think actually that in some ways that is a very reasonable model of human consciousness, and that we have a tendency to massively overrate the, this is also something that's like very attested to in cognitive science experiments. I mean, you can very
Mhm.
much show that people absolutely overrate, the accuracy of their memory, the ability,
Sure.
the degree to which they're consciously deciding things. You can observe that they are first
Yeah.
deciding things, then making up explanations for why they did it, and then they're
Right.
absolutely convinced that there was a reasoned logical thread where they observed A, came to conclusion B, and therefore acted C, even though you can demonstrate in the laboratory that they didn't know A until C had already happened. They literally
Right.
just did C and then thought of B and then observed A and justified it by, like
Yeah, yeah.
so I think we are much messier creations than we think we are. And and writing is a great laboratory to observe that. The fact that
Yeah.
it's so funny that you don't know what your brain is doing, until you
Mhm.
let it do it. And only then, months later, figure out what the hell you
Yeah.
were doing is a beautiful a sort of experimental laboratory to observe, like, because it's easy when you're just kind of doing the laundry and going from place to place in your day to fool yourself into thinking that you're like, obtaining information, coming to
Yeah.
conclusions, making decisions, and then carrying out those actions, and like, whereas actually
Yeah, I've been teaching creative writing for like, I don't know, 10 or 15 years now, right? And it's interesting because the classes I took initially and the way I started teaching initially often had at least a stretch where you were doing exercises, right? Where you were doing things like, and I do recommend anyone listening, Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the
Yep,
Bones is a great
it's a good
starting
one.
point for anybody, I think. And I can go back to it and still find useful things in it decades
Hmm.
later. Um, but, she has one of the exercises is just like keep the pen moving. Doesn't matter if you do a timed writing for 10 minutes. And if you are just writing, I don't know
Hmm.
what to write about,
Right.
that's fine. But you're trying to, and I think I had some of that material in early on. And then I think I over intellectualized it for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a little obsessed with the sort of mechanical aspects of craft and so on. So there was a long stretch when I was teaching where we did almost no generative exercises and it was all analytical, critical.
Hmm.
Let's take the story apart. Let's blah, 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 blah. Let's fix these, very kind of like repair model kind of approach. And lately, I'm throwing a lot of that, not out the window, but it's,
Yeah.
but deprioritizing it
Hmm.
compared to the generative, because
Hmm.
I will do things now like tell my students like, okay, today we're gonna spend a while trying to figure out where it is that we get our ideas, right? Like,
Hmm.
so what is it? And like, let's just have a conversation with it. Like,
Yeah.
what is it that you do that ends up sparking ideas in you? And so, like, maybe it's going to the woods, maybe it's commuting, maybe it's being in the shower, whatever it is, right? Like, maybe it's like for me, watching TV is not generative, right? I
Mm-hmm.
love watching TV,
Yeah.
I do it all the time. But I never come out of it wanting to write stories.
Yeah.
And, but reading fiction is generative,
Hmm.
right? Like
Hmm.
as I am reading, especially good fiction, as
Yeah.
I'm reading, I want to be, I think, in conversation with the
Yeah.
author, and so I end up having that thing. And
Yeah.
that's just me. Like somebody else,
Yeah.
maybe TV is generative for them,
Yeah.
but I feel like that piece of creative writing. Um, I don't
Instruction.
know, the work of being a writer
Mm.
sometimes gets neglected, even at Clarion, at like,
Yeah.
all of these workshops that are very focused on let's get together and critique a story,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Like the
Yeah.
whole Clarion structure is based around that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and there isn't really a phase for like, let's all go out to the woods together
Yeah.
and like do
Although I have
something
seen that
generative,
in
right?
more older, like sort of more post Clarion peer workshops. I do think
Right.
I do see a little bit more of that, like at Blue Heaven workshop that used to, the novel writing workshop Charlie Finney used to run, or Villa
Mhm.
Diodati, that's like the European one, where there's a little more time for like, some of it is just sort of recreational, but it's also like games that are ideational, or some of the slack time.
Yeah.
Clarion's very intense and pressure cooker, and it's a great experience, but like sometimes when you're organizing a workshop like that, having more slack time where there's like we're gonna we're gonna um yeah, that it is, because I also find just hanging out with that con-like space where you're hanging out with people who are
Hmm.
passionate about ideas in that way is very, generative, right? That's like
Yeah.
reignites the fire, makes me want to write. Um, so to try to return to the the arc of
Topic.
the how do we
So
start
yeah.
writing, because we still haven't put an envelope in the mail, and
Yes.
so what happened was that I realized that I wanted to write again, and I was in some startup, and then I moved to Switzerland when I was 29. So I sort of had the ambition of writing, but there wasn't very much time. And when I moved to Switzerland, I was leaving this amazing job where I was making games with all my friends, which is sort of like the ultimate fun programming job. And I
Sure.
was quite depressed about it. And I was like, oh, there's not going to be like a little game startup with all my friends in Switzerland. There's nothing I can do that's gonna be anywhere near as fun. And I called up a friend of mine who was a programmer in Switzerland, and I was like, what I have this dilemma that it's going to be really boring. And he said, well, my job is also really boring, but really well paid and only 3 days a week. And I was like, oh, there could
Yeah.
be not work time. Like, I don't know, as an American, I was
Yeah.
like, surely you should. So I actually structured, and we wanted to have a kid. So the whole year before Aviva was born, I kind of was like, intentionally only took a job, but was like 4 days a week. And then later it went to 3 days a week, where I was like, all right, well, this time is carved out for writing. And I kind of almost miss that period where I didn't really know how it worked or what to do, or like I didn't so much have the idea about like the cycle of submissions, or I didn't have the feeling like how many words have I
Mhm.
done today or whatever. I just flailing, but there was something wonderfully pure in that Rilke way you were talking about having no
Yeah.
idea what the goal of this was really, except that I wanted to pursue it, and sort of, just this flow from journaling to, I don't know, I would walk around downtown and like sit in cafes and scribble on things, and like I didn't, um anyway, then I wrote a bunch of crap stories. And then I eventually wrote some pretty good ones. But the thing
Here, I
about
want to, I want to, I
yeah.
want to give you a one of many Rilke quotes, but
Hmm.
this one's relevant. There is only one solitude, and it is vast, heavy, difficult to bear, and almost everyone has hours when he would gladly exchange it for any kind of sociability, however trivial or cheap, for the tiniest outward agreement with the first person who comes along.
Hmm.
So that's I think that I think that feels like he's talking directly to both of us,
Yeah.
and
Well, as
like
extroverts who
that's
are
the
writers, which is an odd,
right. This is the temptation, right? The temptation is like to abandon the solitude and
yeah.
just like be sociable, be hang out in your game
I'm
design
I'm
group with
not
all your
sure that some
friends,
of our
and
introvert writer friends feel that way. I mean, Rilke says,
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sure it's true what Rilke says, that there are some moments when anybody
yeah,
would have been, but I think there are many people for whom, I think there are also true that for everyone there are moments when
yeah,
that solitude is a solace.
yeah.
And the your mileage may vary as to which of those moments you encounter more frequently, but I think many people become writers because they like to retreat from the hubbub of sociability into like some kind of lonely world.
Okay, so we're only talking about extrovert writers,
Well,
fine.
I don't know.
So
I mean,
yeah, but
I think
yeah,
everybody
but
has a
yeah,
little of both, but you and me are definitely
yeah.
in the same corner of the world there. Um, the other story I wanted to, well, maybe we should. So let's bring you up to the same point. Where let's resume your story.
Okay, let me think.
Now we
So where
had,
we left,
yeah.
well, we left things. No, no, no. I think you're still not quite at the point I was at. So,
Okay.
like, my bring me up to that point. So, I was a kid. I wrote stuff. I got easy praise. I was published in like my poem published in a local newspaper. Whatever, right? Aced my English classes. Didn't
Hmm.
really care about anything else. Um, and then I was the obsessive reader kid. I lived at the library, basically big geek, glasses, whole nine yards. And the immigrant, right? Like, came to the U.S. from Sri Lanka when I was 2, and was the only only South Asian kid in my school until my sisters came. I went to a Polish Catholic school, and so there was I don't know, like I lived half of my life in books, I think, right?
Yeah.
Through much of that time, and I really, um, I did write, and I had fun writing. And in high school, I even like, we had this 1 month course where we got to like create an imaginary world. And my friend Lizette and I like created a whole world together, and we drew maps and did a story and so on. But I never thought I could be a writer.
Hmm.
Right. Like, so that I did not have any aspirations the way
Yeah.
you did.
Yeah.
Because for me, writers were like gods. They
Hmm.
were, like it
Yeah.
was a whole nother realm. I think there was at one point where I tried to write a story and sent it into Marion Zimmer Bradley's one of the Darkover fan anthology
Yeah.
things, and it was rejected, very perfunctory rejection, and that was like the little crushing of my heart. The same thing I think with a Mercedes Lackey, similar kind of thing, and so I don't know, like I just didn't think I could do it. I was sending out poems and publishing them eventually, and then the the weird thing that happened for me was in college, I was dating a white guy, keeping it secret from my parents, and then uh, and then he was working late at the computer lab. This is like a very weird moment in my life. And he wanted company because he had this shift that went till 3 a.m. And I loved him. So I went and kept him company. But then he would like spend all his time on the computer. And I was
Yeah.
like, how am I keeping you company? This is boring. And so this is in like 1990, I guess it
Yeah.
was. And he was like, well, I'm on the news groups. And I had no idea what that was. I was, no one was I had never used email, right? Like this is all super early. So he showed me how to log into my university email. We were all assigned an email address, and then got me onto the news groups. And the news groups, for those youngsters who are like, "What is she talking about?" Are these? They were these text-only discussion boards that were topically organized. So there was like Rec Art Science Fiction Written was one of them. There was Soch.by for talking about bi stuff, etc.
I hate to say
And
this. I mean, I hesitate to say this, but Reddit is probably the closest modern example in terms of the structure, not in terms of culture necessarily, but in terms of the structure of
yeah. Yes. So yes. So I think yeah, it looked like Reddit sort of. But one difference was that when you first signed on, you had to scroll through all of them and say yes or no
it.
for whether you wanted to subscribe, right? So like that was like just the first step. And there were several hundred maybe, and new ones being created all the time. And as I was scrolling through, there was a huge section of sex ones, right? So there was
I'm
alt
just
sex,
laughing in advance at the origin story moment when
it was a very like this
when
is
little
really
Marianne clicks
random.
unsubscribe.
I could easily have gone in a completely different direction. Like if I hadn't dated that guy, I don't know what would have happened, right?
Sure.
So but I saw alt sex and I was like, well, I'm going to join that. That looks
Uh-huh.
interesting. And then there was alt sex stories. And then there was another one, Rec Arts Erotica, which you'd think would be the same thing, but in fact was a little more literary, etc. And then I signed up for a whole bunch of things. Alt sex had like
Just to translate for Gen Z, so one of these is Wattpad and one of them is AO3.
okay. Yes. So yeah. So and I started reading the stories and I think wasn't planning to write any, but they were really poorly written as it turned out because it was just random people putting stories
Sure.
on. And I think that was the turning point for me because I had never
Mm.
been exposed to anything that wasn't decent literature,
Yeah.
right? Like
Well,
published
and
books by
professionally
people who
revised and
right,
proofread and copy
right, who
edited
like
and
made it through. I mean, I'd
yeah.
read my share of like romance schlock and whatever.
Yeah,
I had a
yeah, yeah.
Barbara Cartland phase where
Here's
I read like
Anthony.
100 of them in a row. Piers Anthony, yes, yeah, yeah. So I'd read plenty of that kind of thing, but it was still coherent
Yeah,
and had a plot,
professionally.
whatever. And this stuff, anyway. So I was reading these stories and I was like, oh, I
Hmm.
can spell, I can use
Hmm.
grammar, I can write a better story than 95% of these without much effort. And so I wrote the
I
first
feel like
story I
there are these
wrote.
two moments in many writers' biography. One in which you read something amazing and you're like, oh my god, if only I could do that. And then one in which you read something kind of crap and you're like, I can do better than that. And
Yeah,
both of those polls are like kind of
yeah.
like chart your course.
Well, and this is actually why I love going to poetry readings. I always have that effect at a poetry reading, both of them,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah,
There's always like at a good reading, right? There's always somebody who says something and I'm like, oh, that was incredible. I
yeah,
love that. And
yeah.
that's inspiring. And there's also someone else where I'm listening to them drone on and I'm like, why are they up there? Like I should be up there,
I
right?
should
So
be up there. Both of
could get.
those moments are important. I mean, I
Yeah,
think,
you need both. You need both.
yeah.
I mean, and similarly, I think there's another way I've heard this phrased is that to be a successful writer, you both have to have arrogance to like think that you're writing your words and thoughts are worth somebody else's time to read, but also a crushing sense of inferiority and incompetence because that's what gets you to revise and like have the humility to like keep working on it,
Sure.
right? To like make it better. Anyway,
yeah.
But
and there's also interestingly, I mean, there's also moments which are simultaneously both, where you're like, which is where you are where something is well done but you hate it, like, you know what I mean? Where it's like, this is brilliant and I just can't wait to argue with it. Like, you have said so well something I disagree with so profoundly. That's anyway.
I'm blanking on his name, but there's a guy in the New York Times who publishes a conservative columnist. What's his name? He's deeply persuasive, and it makes me really angry, right? Like, I read his articles, and I'm like, whoa, step by step, the logic of this is persuasive, and you get to a conclusion that I fundamentally disagree with, right? And like, anyway, Edmund Burke reading him is also like that father of modern conservatism. I'm like, wow, you're a beautiful, brilliant writer. Your use of metaphors is awesome. And this is horrible. Reflections on the Revolution in France. I recommend it to you all to have a good rage read. But so I don't know, maybe you will not have this response, but he's talking about Marie Antoinette getting her head chopped off and comparing her to a star in the heavens and saying, what's happened to chivalry and what happened to anyway. Okay, putting all of that aside, and I'm finishing this bit of the story. So I wrote some stories. I put them out there. The first one was called American Airlines Cockpit and was exactly what it sounds like. Two girls get on a plane, seduce the pilot, etc. And people loved it. And this goes back to the praise. So like I wrote like 20
It's funny
stories
that when you describe that, my first thought is for air safety.
Yeah, I know.
Is there an autopilot? Is the co-pilot paying attention? Like, I'm worried now.
In retrospect, I'm like, American Airlines could have come after me for that story, right? Like, you're maligning our pilots who would never, ever, ever do anything like this. But of course, yes, I'm sure.
Or you could have gotten product placement from some like autopilot provider, I suppose.
That's right. They did, I believe, put on the autopilot safety first.
Yeah.
But then
use protection.
So. Yeah. So I wrote these stories. I put them out. 20 of them. No gatekeepers, right? Anyone could post anything.
Right.
But I got a lot of praise, and people whose stories I did like on that group said nice things about it. And so by the end of a year or so, I think I had joined or helped form an erotica writers mailing list where we were starting to like share critiques and market info and so on. And then I started sending things out, and my first professional publication was erotic science fiction or erotic fantasy. It was to Cecilia Tan was running Circlet Press, which specialized in erotic science fiction fantasy. And she had a volume, Sex Magic 2, and I just sent in a story that I think was Fleeing Gods, about Zeus coming back to Earth and hitting on a modern woman and then freaking out when she's into it and not running away from him. And there's a whole like transformation scene where they're like changing into different animals and storms and whatever, but like he's given her the power to transform so that he can have the fun of chasing her, but she starts chasing him and he freaks out. Anyway, so silly little, it's like 1,000-word reversal story, moderately amusing, has been reprinted 4 times. So here's my tip for any writers listening. If you can be funny, that is a big advantage in publication, because most things that come in are not funny. And I almost never manage to write funny, but this one. Anyway, so I think I'd found my niche, and I started publishing there, and I had a strong interest in writing about sexuality at that point because sex was this huge area of conflict in my life. Growing up with conservative immigrant parents, and writers, I think, are drawn to working out their problems and
Yeah.
poking
Sure.
at the pain in their
Yeah.
fiction, right? So,
Charged.
yeah.
Charged
So
things.
I
Yeah.
don't know. She paid me maybe $50 for that first story.
Uh-huh.
So, um,
I mean,
but that's yeah.
and I think there's an important bit there about the, you're talking about the progression from alt sex stories to the anthology of, science fiction erotica. And I think that's often, I think that's another thing I was missing when I was like, there's like, it was like panel 1 is me, scribbling. Panel 3 is Nobel laureate. You know what I mean? Like panel 2, we're not sure. Like like the Dilbert thing, like step 2
Yeah.
question mark, step 3 profit. Like step 3 greatness in this case. There is a kind of um, because we live in this, it's similar to what you're saying about like we develop taste by reading great stuff and then we think we ought to sit down and read great stuff. We live in this broadcast world where everything is very enormous. And for a while I was kind of worried about our culture, about this effect where you the things you see are these amazingly crafted things. And like it used to be that if you were a good storyteller, you'd be the storyteller of the village and like you'd have an audience of 200 people, and that was like this very fulfilling and important thing. And now it's like, well, the top 200 people get to be storytellers of everyone, and everyone else is like, you know what I mean? Like that sort of extreme hierarchy is destructive. But one of the wonderful things that's happened, we were talking about how things have changing, but even like in the last 10 years, like I feel like there's this flowering of all these like small worlds again, because there's fan fiction and YouTubers and like the long tail, the sort of content
Yeah.
driven long tail is like creates this world in which everybody is a little, I mean, even just people like tweeting, like everybody is sort
Hmm.
of a creator for their own little, which has a double-edged sword, because of course there's this constant um there's there are these periods in which certain things get to be professions that you can live on, and then they're amateurized, and that is also both that has two sides, right? I mean, it's both democratizing and also kind of horrifying. um but but I don't know. I sort of feel like that's a very natural progression. And if you look at all the things that people who started in fanfic and go on to
Hmm.
profic, or don't and are just amazing at fanfic, like there's this, it's sort of, or it's just sort of nice if there's some niche in which in that small world you have room to grow and flourish before you are just on the biggest stage.
Right. Yeah,
Anyway.
and you skip that. I think, like one way I used to talk about it is that how like artists will talk about like that was, this artist's blue period or
Yeah,
whatever
yeah,
else,
yeah.
right? And I find that useful, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think juvenilia is in the same vein,
Mm-hmm.
but it's very dismissive,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like when
Sure.
you talk about
Sure.
the juvenilia, you're like, well, that was terrible, but I was only young.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
okay that it was
Yeah.
terrible. But in actual fact, like, when people set out to publish, let's say you're in science fiction fantasy and you're trying to publish short fiction, there's this question of like, you've written a story, do you start at the top of the market and
Mm-hmm.
work your way down,
Yeah. Yeah.
or do
Which is the
you
traditional
aim
advice.
well, that's interesting. I did not hear that as
Really?
necessarily
Oh,
traditional
okay.
advice. No, I have always heard that you have to make a choice,
Mm.
because if you do that, you're going to have a lot of failure for a long time, almost certainly, right? And
Huh. Yeah.
so, and it's super time consuming. Maybe in part because I was in, like, I have one foot in science fiction fantasy and one foot in the literary
Mm.
fiction world,
Yeah.
and in lit fic, keep in mind that people are doing MFAs, they're writing short
Yeah.
stories. They often have a very tight timeline for
Right.
publication
Right. Right.
because they're trying to get academic jobs to
Yeah.
support them.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
And it's a very different
so,
world, because there's some hard line of like, is it essentially the equivalent of a peer reviewed journal? Like, is this enough? Is this prestigious enough? If it's some academic journal by somebody, even if they pay in copies, like
right,
that counts for tenure.
exactly, right.
So
So
it's
there's
binary.
all these little magazines. There were 300 plus when
Mm-hmm.
I was in grad school. There are probably more now, um, that count, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if your goal was to like, well, I want to, by the time I finish my 2-year MFA program, have 5 publications before I start applying for teaching
Yeah.
jobs,
Yeah.
then you don't want to send things to the New Yorker,
Right.
Harper's, Atlantic,
Right.
which have like an 8-month lead time
Sure.
before they even look at your story, if they
If
look
they
at it.
do, yeah, sure.
Right, right. And we were hearing all these horror stories about like, well, what happens to your story when it goes to the New
Yeah.
Yorker? It goes into this big warehouse.
Yeah.
All those manila envelopes get stacked up there,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
once in a while, an intern comes and
Wanders
grabs
by.
a
Yeah.
handful
Sure.
and looks at them, and like that's the fate of your story. And
Yeah.
so I think I don't know.
But that's a
I
very
always
different
had
world
it
than
as
the
a
genre world.
well, but I think
Like, it is
so
not
maybe
true that
so
at the
maybe
top
I
genre
could
magazines there are warehouses of manila envelopes. Like, that stuff's all getting read. So it's maybe by first readers.
well, sort of, kind of, right? I mean, I think that what happens at the top genre magazine. There's that the Tale of Myrtle the Manuscript. Have you read that?
No.
No? Oh, this is a classic thing. I think that's the name of it. Let me see if I can find it. Well, we're talking, yeah, the sobering saga of Myrtle the Manuscript is on the SIFWIS site. And
Yeah.
it is a classic story of what actually happened to a story back in the old days when it went to an editor's desk and so on. But, what happens, right? Let's say you are Gardner Dozois and you're editing Asimov's. You're getting floods of these manila envelopes coming in. They get stacked somewhere in the office. It was back in the old days, children. So, and you know, when Gardner has a Friday afternoon to read some new manuscripts, when he's dealt with the rest of the week, he's editing, he's dealing with the business of the magazine, et cetera, so on. Right? Most of the time, in fact, my understanding from editors in New York is that still today they almost never get to read during the 9 to 5 job.
Mm-hmm.
They read
Sure.
on the train going back and
Sure.
forth. They read on the weekends is when they read submissions. So,
I mean, I feel though.
well, and
Go ahead.
just to finish,
Mm-hmm.
so that when he opens those manuscripts, he's now glancing at the cover letter, and maybe he sees you went to Clarion, maybe he sees you did an MFA, maybe he sees you were published in analog, right? So he's paying a little more attention to your story, or you have none of those things. But regardless, he starts reading, and by the end of the first paragraph, he's decided whether or not he's wants to read the next one.
Sure.
And for the vast majority of them, he doesn't. So those stories aren't getting read, I would say. On a fundamental level, they aren't getting read. They're often sitting. This is the reason why there was this website Black Hole, right, that tracks response times for magazines, because so many of them, it was like your story went into a black hole. So I don't know.
I mean, I
always
want to push
had,
back against that. I mean, I feel like I'm paying attention. I'm submitting short stories. I'm paying pretty close attention. I know people who work there, and I think the situation now, and I'm worried that if part of the purpose of this podcast is like, here, young writers, I'm a little worried about sending this bleak message of, to equate what happens at the New Yorker or Harper's, where it's like, that is a complete crapshoot, a manila envelope is somewhere, with what's happening at Asimov's, which after all is a much smaller world. Like the circulation of Asimov's, that's a much tinier world, or Lightspeed or Apex or Strange Horizons. If you go through the markets that are if you list them by how often they get awards, which is sort of the relevant, that would be one relevant criteria for assessing prestige. I mean, pay rate's another.
Sure.
Those are probably close. But if you look at so Tor.com is closed to submissions. That's very above board. You cannot submit to Tor.com. You have to know somebody. That's the top of the market. Then you immediately get to like Uncanny, Apex, Lightspeed, Clark's World. I'm pretty sure that in all of those cases, first of all, a lot of those have very quick submission response times. Go pull them up on Black Hole submissions. Like, they're all automated. It's all on email. And no, you are probably being read by a first reader, and they may only, and frankly, in some of those, I think the first readers are probably reading the whole thing. I think the old days in which the classic FNSF rejection didn't grab me meant I read the first paragraph. But I would say that I would call that being read. I think what I'm blanking. Who is FNSF before Charlie? He's the first guy to publish me. I'm blanking.
Gordon Van de Elder.
Gordon. So right, Gordon clearly very, very transparent, very, very open process. long before anybody, when I very, very, very first sent stuff to FNSF, I don't think the response time was that long, maybe 2 weeks. And didn't grab me meant I didn't get past the first paragraph, and I got plenty of didn't grab me's. That is getting read. That is sufficient for my purposes. That is a sufficient.
Okay,
Now,
so
I am
maybe
not
you're
suggesting that. I
yeah.
am not suggesting that like the point of the exercise is not that someone is giving a dense critical read and leisurely steeping in the manuscript. That's not, I'm not making that claim. But what I am saying is there's a difference between saying, well, it's a futile exercise versus saying it is actually, honestly, if it's 2 weeks and a stamp, not even anymore, right? 2 weeks and an upload for someone to read your first paragraph, that does not seem like a very high cost. Like you know what I mean? Like the submission time does, the submission
again,
response time does matter.
This has changed somewhat over time, right? And I actually think the website Black Hole had a lot to do with that. By making that transparent, suddenly everyone knew which sites were bad about it, and there was pressure on the magazines to get faster. The way you deal with that generally is by hiring slush readers, volunteer slush readers, who often have no qualifications, except that they're willing to do it, right? And the editors often have no qualifications
maybe,
either, right?
but it's not actually all that hard to find. I mean, I know plenty of pretty good, who I consider pretty good writers who work as slush readers. Like, it's not that hard to, like, given the massive disparity, given there's so many people with so much time, it's not actually that. I expect it wouldn't be that hard to find. You got volunteer slush readers, and they were or volunteer editors for Strange Horizons. They were magnificent editors.
Well, okay, so let me back you up a little bit. We didn't when I started. Or when I was running the magazine. And Jed resisted having slush readers for many years. So for a long time, Strange Horizons did not have slush readers.
Sure.
And it took, I don't know, at least I think I would say probably close to a decade before he finally bowed under the weight of the submissions that was coming in and admitted that he needed them.
Untypical. And I think there are a lot of those. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Benjamin.
Yes.
I'm not sure what you're trying to defend here.
I'm hoping our podcast listeners will not go, oh, well, never mind. I'll cut the top 10 markets off my list. I have no shot anyway as a no one.
No, so I think that's
what I'm trying to defend.
Yes, but I'm not arguing not to apply to the top 10 markets. I'm saying, if you would let me finish, right, is that there are two approaches, and I have always had these two approaches in mind to submitting manuscripts. One approach is to start at the top and work your way down. That used to be very costly in terms of time. I would say now it's actually much less costly. Great. There's very little reason not to start with Clarkesworld, which has an incredibly fast response time, and then work your way down. But the other approach, and this is what we were talking about before, is to aim for where you think you've got a good shot of being published. And this is, I think, why I had early confidence and success in publishing, and that kept me going for a long time, and you crashed and burned for a long time and ran away from writing, right?
Yeah, although honestly, that's not why, because I literally submitted one thing at 14 and got an excellent response. So it wasn't, right? I mean, actually getting the New Yorker to read it and say, I really like this story, you should submit it to a new Jewish magazine, is actually not a rejection, really.
So you were getting stuff even before you submitted. But if you
mostly internally.
So maybe it wouldn't have been the rejections. You were self-rejecting before you got to that point. I was
self-rejecting, yes.
Right. But I think for a lot of writers and a lot of my students, I think if they start, and I'm not going to advise people to do one or the other, because it's really dependent on your personality and how you're going to respond to the rejection. But if you are very rejection sensitive and 3 rejections are going to shut you down, then maybe starting with the New Yorker for each one is
totally wanted. This is the bit I wanted to get to, which is about the psychology. And so I just wanted to clear out of the way what I thought was the spurious reason not to do it, which is sort of like you don't have a shot, because you obviously have.
I never said that.
No, I know, but the image, but I think that is I think the only point I was making is that I don't think we should put Harper's, where you're going to send a manuscript and literally no human may ever read the words in the manuscript. I don't think that's in the same box as some place that's I didn't like the first paragraph, here's a rejection, and that happens in 2 weeks, which I think is what most of the top.
I mean, I will say, but again, I wasn't. I think you
Yeah.
keep assuming I'm saying things I'm not saying, which is a little frustrating. So, like The Atlantic, for example, I would send them stories over the transom, no agent,
Yeah.
whatever, in my 20s, and they sent me personalized rejections. It made it clear that somebody there
Yeah.
had read the story,
Yeah.
right? So I think some of those places, but I
Well,
think it's,
maybe they do.
but I would say it's really important for writers to understand the processes that are happening at a lot of these publications,
Hmm.
the vast majority of them, in part because that also lowers the stakes. If
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know that at
Yeah.
Quarterly West, you've
Sure.
been published at Quarterly West,
Sure.
the process at Quarterly West, which is one of the little magazines
Hmm.
that's put out by the University of Utah, which is when I was there, it's run by grad students. It has one part time paid
Hmm.
editor.
Hmm.
The submissions come in over the course of the year. In the fall, at some point, we have a pizza party with beer, and we all get together with all the big stacks of,
Hmm.
whoever feels like it, including English undergrads, are invited to join us,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Who all get together with the big stacks of manila envelopes. We open them, we pull out the thing, we read the first paragraph. If we think it's good, we keep reading. If not, we reject it right there.
Right.
If we
Sure.
like
Toss
it, it
it
gets
in the pile.
passed up to the next editor. Like
Right.
that's the slush reading process. So understanding that, I actually think, is really good for your confidence, because it makes it clear that in some ways it's a numbers game.
Hmm.
Writing a lot, sending out a lot is going to make a huge difference.
Hmm.
But also, just because you got a rejection from Strange Horizons, it doesn't mean, in fact, that the whole editorial team hates your work,
Right.
right? It
Right.
probably
Or even
means
thought
that a
very
slush
much, or even thought very much
or
about your work more
or
than, yeah.
saw your work, right? Because
Right.
probably it means a slush
Somebody.
reader read the first paragraph,
Sure.
some
Yeah,
random
well,
slush
that's
reader,
a
and I think
very
that's
important piece. I mean, yes,
right.
I
So,
100% agree that that's a very important data. And I don't want to. I mean, I'm not. I don't want to get stuck on what you weren't saying, because I think we largely agree. I think that, and I do want to get to the part which I think is the important part that we both want to talk about, which is the psychological aspect. Like, what
mhm,
is the right place for you? Because I think this is actually very crucial. What is the right way for you to structure your submission process if you're planning on submitting things, um, that will have you flourish as a human being? Like, and I think that
mhm,
there's a couple of pieces of that. One is that, um, there's a couple of things that, uh, that I here's the thing. I think really that what I would say is that um, there's a virtuous cycle that you're trying to kickstart, where you are going to get into a wider conversation, you're going to get satisfaction, you're going to feel connected to the wider world. The whole reason not to leave the manuscript in your drawer, but to like
mhm,
email it somewhere or upload it somewhere or put it in a middle envelope in the old days, is that you want to is that that's actually not just it's not for the, whatever it is now, 7 cents a word. Like, it's probably not the 7 cents a word. Like,
mhm,
that's not really, I mean, that's sometimes a useful marker. Like, sometimes how much the word rate is very important, and it's just like Black Hole had the effect on submission times. I think SIFWA establishing a minimum rate for qualifying
sure,
publications has had a big effect, and that's great, because it avoided what happened in the literary world, which is that there's a race to the bottom, everybody pays in copies. In science fiction, there's a floor established by SIFWA, so
mhm,
publications aspire to publish decent rates, which is great because it's work and labor and should be remunerated. But and I also should say, depending on where you live and who you are, that might be. I mean, in some places in the world, maybe 7 cents a word is actually still a perfectly, like, actually a really financially important
well,
proposition. There are
and in
people.
fact,
Yeah.
with internationalization,
Yeah.
when we
Sure.
buy a story from India, for
Right.
example, it goes a lot
It
farther,
goes a
right?
lot
So,
farther. So that could be. So, I
yeah.
mean, your mileage may vary, and it may be that you very seriously. And there are people who are really masterful at figuring out exactly what market and having very high productivity. And I think there are people who, in fact, it is
Well,
a
and I have to say
financial
that's
proposition.
this is closer to where I am now, right? These days, I'm um, when I sit down to write, I'm having to carve away time from other things, right? And so I actually do think about the finances a lot, and like Wildcards gets prioritized because I get paid $2,000 to $3,000 plus royalties on a wildcard story,
Right,
right? So
but we're not. But the stage we're talking about, the thing we were. I mean, sure, me too. I mean, I think that's
no,
useful to talk about
like
too. But
so, and like Strange Horizons, when I was, you know, when I was a grad student, right? Like
yeah,
getting paid $500 for a story was like,
significant.
a month's rent. It
Sure.
was significant,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. No.
So
So I don't want to say that it's completely
yeah,
insignificant, but I want to say is that it's not. And if your productivity is rate is high and your budget is low and your
yeah,
whatever, it could be that it is quite significant, and then you should optimize, and then that's the criteria you should optimize for. But actually, in a sense, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the reason I say it doesn't matter. You're trying
right.
to get this
Putting that
virtuous.
aside,
You're trying to get the
right? Yeah,
virtuous cycle kickstarted, and it could be that the money for rent is part of that virtuous cycle. It could be that
right.
you know being part of a wider conversation is part of that virtuous cycle, whatever it is. But I think that the that you are, whether you start at the top or whether you pick something that you feel connected to and that you have a good shot at or whatever. I don't. So I guess there's two things that I want to say. One is that you want to optimize for the bang for the buck in terms of what's going to make you energized in your process, right? You
Hmm.
want to be training your brain that this is something that is nourishing you.
Yeah.
And I think there are two parts of that. One is strategically deciding what makes sense for you in terms of like what you want to achieve and what, how like whether it's an ego boost or like paying your rent, like what,
Yeah. Yeah.
like that's, and being, sort of thinking about that. The other thing is building up your tolerance for rejection. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And one of the best things you can do is submit it to places that you will get rejected from if you're training yourself to, if that's part of the positive cycle, because the rejection can be very useful. So what I did when I started sending stuff out, the very first time I sent a story out, like in this mode where you're
Hmm.
uploading and whatever, um, and we're talking, I should say, we're talking very, very much about this sort of very classic genre thing where you're uploading the story at 6,000 words. You're sending it
Hmm.
to a publication that's, maybe it's a fanzine and it's 1 cent a word, or maybe it's 7 cents a word, a prozine or whatever. But like, this is, I mean, there's a lot of ways that you could have creative output.
Sure.
Like, we're not even talking about all the many ways in the world that you could participate in things. I mean, or we're
Right.
not talking about
Right.
Kickstarter. We're not talking about, but in this sort of classic mode, what I did was I realized that I was probably going to be rejected because I was new at this, and there were a million people. I mean, no matter how much care they put into optimizing the system and whether they really read more than a paragraph or whatever, it's still a vast number of stories per editor. So obviously, they're no matter what they do, they're going to reject most of them. Like, you're right,
Yeah.
and so so one thing that I realized was that I was very likely entering into a vicious cycle. Like, I was going to send this, I was going to reject it, I was going to take that rejection
Hmm.
as a negative, and it was going to feel for my brain like something bad had happened because I got rejected,
Hmm.
and then I would be a little more aversive. And so the more I sent out stories, the more I would get rejections, and the more aversive I would become, and I would send about slower and slower and become more and more hesitant, and pretty soon I'd stop writing. Like, I had a very clear picture of that, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so I was like, well, what I need to do is rewire my brain so that that's not the case, right?
So I see what you're saying. I got to say, like,
Well, this is very specific to me, but let me tell you what I
yeah.
did to rewire my brain. Now, I'm a computer programmer, and I live with a cognitive behavioral psychologist.
I mean, it sounds like what people who are like treating PTSD like will sometimes do
Yes, yes,
with
it's very much exactly, which you could argue perhaps I was doing. It's very much a behavioral psychologist approach to the problem, because my wife is a cognitive behavioral psychologist. What I did, and I'm also a game designer, and I love games. Like, I'm super
right.
competitive and game oriented. So, and I had enough insight to be like, it's actually not true that rejection is bad, because I knew that you have to paper your wall with rejections. Like, my brain, the top of my brain knew that it is, in fact, if I was going to achieve the goal of being like a working writer, I would have to get rejected 1,000 times until then. Like, that was very likely. Like, it would be very weird if I just wrote a story for the first time, sent it off, and was accepted. That would be weird. like not impossible, but I was not betting on being Ted Chiang, right? I was betting on being me. So I figured there would be a lot of rejection involved, and that in fact that was part of the process, part of me learning and everything. So it was actually, I knew at the top of my brain that rejection was actually a sign of a small step towards my goal, but that it
Mm-hmm.
felt like it was a failure. And so what I did
Right.
was I made a game of giving myself points.
All right.
So I gave myself 1 point for a form letter rejection, 2 points. I still do this. It's two
Mm-hmm.
points for a personal rejection, 4 points for like a referral to somewhere else, which has rarely ever happened, and 10 points for an acceptance. And this was when I was like, a little baby science fiction writer, and I figured that I wanted to rewire my brain, and I knew about Clarion as this nebulous, vague, fuzzy thing that the
Mm-hmm.
ancients did. I knew that it sort of existed, and I decided that the goal of this game was if I got 100 points, I would go to Clarion. Now, at this point, I was like already, I mean, I was about to become a dad. Maybe this is a little before that, but I knew we wanted to have kids. I had a job. I was a grown up. So it was like going to be a lot to take 6 weeks out of my life. Like, you know what I mean? I was having, I mean, I only had 5 weeks of vacation, which is a lot for, I mean, I don't know what Americans do. Like
Yeah, yeah.
in America, you have to quit your job to go to Clarion, I guess, or be a student or an academic. But I mean, I was in Switzerland, so there was like 5 weeks of vacation, even as a regular working stiff. And I was like, I basically had to like have a week of comp time, just to
Mm-hmm.
get to Clarion, and that would be my, it was in Seattle on the other side of the world, so it was like going to be a huge lift. And like, was it really justified for me to do this extremely extravagant thing? And I decided that if I was actually selling stories, then that would mean I was a writer. But also, if I'd gotten 100 form rejections, then that was sufficient evidence that I really cared about this and was
Right.
sufficiently tenacious that this was a real thing. Even if I hadn't figured out how to write yet, it would be worth it to go. And so I started playing this game, and I rigorously, like every time I sent it out, and it did shift my attitude, because instead of hating rejections, I hated waiting. Like I was waiting, and that was agonizing. But as soon as I got a rejection, I was like, yes, I got a point, put it in another envelope, send it out again. It was like the day that I got a rejection was like a win, because it was like I'm
Yeah.
100th of the way closer to Clarion, and like I've got the next envelope ready, so it goes into the next envelope. Like that was
Yeah.
like and that like increased my throughput, because it was gamified,
Right.
and it was like and it was training my brain to be like, oh, this is a small step towards my goal. I did it. I sent it out there. I took the I brought it, and I lost this round, because that's the expected result. An exception. I mean, an acceptance is out of my control. That's like a gift from the gods. That's like, who knows? What the hell? I
Yeah, yeah.
happened to hit the lottery. But like the rejection was the thing I could actually control. Like that I was, you know.
So I love that, and I think, it would be a great thing to, like, just add to, like, an intermediate fiction writing class or
Hmm.
something, right? Like, let's start the semester with
Hmm.
this model as an and, like, let's you guys are all writing stories already and sending them out.
Yeah.
Let's gamify it.
Hmm.
So that's terrific. I'd say three things I wanna say. One is that I've never in 25 years, like, I've never heard any other writer talk about deliberately hardening themselves to rejection, and I think I think it's great, but I think it's like kind of a new idea for the field. Like, it's
Mm,
not the way people are usually taught to approach
mhm,
things. So I
mhm.
think it's really
Sure.
interesting. I think we should talk about that more. But um, two, I guess, you talked about there's the Ted Chiang approach of, like, and for people who don't know, this is Chiang, Ted Chiang, who is known for writing award-winning short stories, one of which was made into an amazing movie. So we recommend his work to you.
Called The Arrival.
Like, The Arrival was the movie. The stories are great. The story of your life, brilliant. Um, and he's sort of like held up as an exemplar of, like, oh, every story he writes wins an award, right? Like, so he doesn't write them
Practically.
that
Yeah.
often, and he has not, I think, written a novel yet. He's got a novella. But the so, like, that's like the, oh, I don't know, artist in the garret kind of approach of, like, I will go away, I will eventually write something
Hmm.
brilliant, it will
Yeah.
come out
Very
and be,
perfectionist approach. Yeah.
yeah, be lauded, right? And I knew people in grad school like this, right? Who they mostly didn't want to show their work to anyone, and they would just work on it over and over and ongoing. And you were just like, okay, well, we'll see you maybe in 20 years. You're going to emerge
You'll
with a
have a
great
masterpiece.
American
Right,
novel.
right.
Maybe not.
Maybe,
Right.
maybe not. Yeah.
So that was very clearly never going to be my approach.
Uh-huh.
Right. So
Uh-huh.
like you could be that kind of writer, and maybe Nabokov, maybe, I don't know actually enough about Nabokov. What's his name who wrote the book about V and the
Thomas Pynchon.
postman? Pynchon, right? Like famously reclusive, etc. Goes
Sure.
off and writes
Sure.
and so on. So the other, then there's the Ben option of hardening yourself to rejection. But that like you kind of pose those as like two options, and I think the middle option is what I was talking about before, is like learning how to assess where your work is, and then aiming for the market that will take it, so that you don't expect to paper. Like, I did not plan to paper my walls with rejections. I did not plan to have, I was sort of always assuming that I'm going to have at least a 50% hit rate on acceptances, which I pretty much have had, right? But part of the reason I've had that is by aiming for that and aiming for markets that, like, so you have to know the market reasonably well. You have to actually read the magazines. You have to have enough of a critical eye to be able to assess your own work and say, like, is this as good as what they're publishing? And then send it out to them. So maybe that
is
doesn't work for
fascinating to
everyone.
me. I mean, this is fascinating to me. And I similarly to how you were just like, I've never heard anyone in 25 years talk about hardening themselves to rejection.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that I've never heard of this exactly, but I would say that I think in many ways we've sort of noted all the ways in which you and I are very similar. But it's also interesting the ways in which you and I are very different. And I don't know if this is about my critical capacity or who we are as people or what, but I was actually going to say almost the exact opposite of that as an encouraging thing for our podcast listeners, which is that one of the great lessons for me in submitting was that I started with this notion that the highest quality is at the top. Like, those are the highest quality magazines. They pay the most cents per word or whatever. They're prestigious. And then there's another tier, a mid tier. They are slightly less quality. And you could figure out where your thing was in terms of quality and whatever. That has not been my experience. I have never been able to estimate. And let me just say, like, my most well-known story, which was published at Quarterly West, is a story that had been rejected all kinds of places. It was rejected from all the genre markets. It was rejected from Aboriginal Science Fiction, a semi-prozine run out of... I
remember that one.
Yes, right? I went through from the top, it went all the way down. I saw literary markets, all of them, and it ended up being bought by Quarterly West. And then Harper's, which had previously rejected it, bought it as a reprint. I'm sure they didn't know that they'd rejected it. And then it was in Harper's. And then it was like made into a film that won Best Animated Short at South by Southwest and put on YouTube, and 500,000 people saw it. So it is by far the thing most people have seen.
Terrible at promoting himself. The name of the story is The Orange.
The Orange.
And you can read it on his website.
But the funny thing about that is that sort of blew up any model I had about, like, well, clearly, the winner of the best of like animated short at South by Southwest is above Aboriginal Science Fiction, a semi-prozine paying 3 cents a word. No, it's like totally subjective.
So, but I don't think so I disagree.
Well,
I disagree.
Maybe not. Maybe not for you.
You took the wrong lesson from it, right? So, which is that there is subjectivity. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Jed and I argue about this fiercely. So we should at some point get Jed on here and talk about, is there such a thing as good fiction and bad fiction? And then we can just explode that at great length. And like, what does quality mean anyway? Like, that's a whole, I think, a 3-person conversation that would be very interesting. But that said, I'm generally going to say there are better and worse stories. There are higher and lesser quality stories. That is just all modulated by a lot of chance in the submission, editorial, etc. process, as we were discussing earlier with what random slush reader at Harper's read your story the first time around, etc. B, things like the editor's mood on the day they read it, how open they are to like releasing. I mean, I teach that story of yours. My students consistently love it. Love it every semester because it is a very good story. It is a 1-page, brilliant little piece, and it makes me cry basically every time I read it.
That
by the
is
time
very
I get to
kind
the
of
end.
you, and I also like that story a lot. And I'm not claiming
I would say, like, so the lesson from that is not, like the lesson is, well, there were a bunch of people who were not in the right headspace or whatever who rejected. None of them should have rejected it. They should have
I
all taken that
I
story,
would not
or
go that
or it
far.
was or it was the wrong kind of story for their magazine, in which case there was a mismatch with your submitting to them. So, like,
I think there's, I
so
don't want to take an extreme position and say there's no story quality and it's all relative and unpredictable. I'm not
yeah,
saying
yeah.
that. And I think it's a good story and I thank you for your kind words. But I also think that, I mean, part of I know your students love it, but there's also such a thing as author points. And like, if your professor is excited about this story and
No, no,
that
no.
story,
I presented very neutrally. First day of
okay,
class,
okay.
they know
But
nothing at that point.
but my point is that I think it partly is, I suspect that if my problem as a writer had been, if I had been, I suspect this is partly about me, because I suspect if I had been someone who was naturally good at sort of rip-roaring yarns with a very clear beginning, middle, and end, but I had a little trouble with like felicity of expression, and I was long-winded, and the sentences were a little clunky, and I had too much exposition, and many such journeyman mistakes, then like I would have gradually gotten better in the sense that the line level quality, the conciseness of expression, the vividness of
Mhm,
metaphors
mhm.
would have gradually improved. And so my rip roaring yarns would have gone from being rather boring to trudge through to eventually being excellent simply by a sort of a general improvement of quality throughout. If that had been the case, then probably I would have been able to be at the beginning of my career like, oh, well, I should submit to these fanzines and then these semi-prozines and then these prozines. However, the thing about me is that I came out of the box writing amazing sentences in weird ass ways, which were sometimes precious and over intellectual, or like, you know what I mean? Like the
Mhm.
errors I was
Yeah.
making were errors where, and even now, my stories absolutely split the crowd. Like, and not only did they split the crowd in the sense that some people love them, some people hate them, but every single review of the Ant King and other stories that I have read, which was my
Mhm.
collection from Small Beer from 2008, and since I don't promote enough, every single review was like one review would be like, these are all gems, except for Other Cities, which I don't know what that's doing there. It's sort of a meandering pseudo Borgesian whatever. And then another thing would be like, these are mostly crap, but Other Cities, man, that it was amazing. That's like a beautiful. I mean, literally, like I'm not talking, and
Well, but
I'm not talking about
there,
Amazon
there is
reviewers. I'm talking about reviewers in newspapers.
right, right,
None of
but
them
this
agreed.
is. But this is not really a quality thing, and if they're talking about it in terms of quality, then I would say they are doing a poor job reviewing,
Oh, I
right?
don't
Like,
know.
because
Sure.
it's that kind of review is more about taste, right? And more about, like, are you,
Yes.
the reader, engaged in the same project as the writer, right? Like, and have you gotten to that same, so, like, I think
I
that's a
agree,
different
but
kind
I
of
agree. But
thing.
here's what I would say: editors get enough stories that after they
Mhm.
reject all the stories they can clearly reject on the basis of quality, they are then mostly deciding on taste, and their tastes vary wildly. So sure, some people,
Yeah.
if your problem is you can't write a vivid sentence, then you'll be able to improve at that craft level skill, and that will elevate you up the ladder of qualifications. However, there's also no accounting for taste, so that even if you are like you
Yeah,
know what I mean.
yeah, no, you could,
So
absolutely, but just in terms of,
so it
I
may
think
well, what I'm saying is
it's
it may well
yeah.
be that you will get a but you will be, I think this is a, not at all an unreasonable scenario, that you would be like, I have identified these I think I know what my level of quality is. I will submit to these magazines that are of that level of quality, and then you reject it from all of them, and you're like, oh, I guess I should go down. But in fact, it turns out that if you went up, they would accept you. I don't think that's an unreasonable scenario, because depending on what it is they're rejecting you for, which you
So
don't
this
really know.
so this gets to the third aspect. So that I wanted to touch on, which was who persists and who doesn't.
Hmm.
So at Strange Horizons, at one point we did a survey, and we found that, or not really a survey, but like tracked the submission patterns of the people submitting to the magazine. This was after I had left, but and one of the things we found was that men
Hmm.
persisted
Yeah.
after getting two, three, four, five, six, seven rejections.
Hmm.
Were still sending us stories,
Yeah.
and women did not.
Right.
Women would maybe get one, two rejections, and then we'd never hear from them again.
Yep.
And often with the men, we would find that maybe the eighth story we buy,
Hmm.
sometimes they've gotten better over the course of that time because this took a couple of years and they've been working on their craft. Sometimes it's just that the eighth all the other stories were pretty good, but not quite hitting right. And it's the eighth story that was like, yes, this one is exactly what the editor wants
Right.
in this moment in
And a
time,
lot of
right?
times that's
But
taste. Jed doesn't like zombies. Like, it literally
right,
often
right,
is the other
right.
7 stories some other editor
Yes,
would have bought them.
sure.
Yeah.
Right, agreed. So, I would say taste modulates this whole
Mm-hmm. Sure.
discussion, and we should just, take that as a given.
Yeah.
But the question then is, why do women stop submitting, right? And this goes to marginalized groups
Mm-hmm.
and conservation of resources,
Mm-hmm.
right? And because I ended up going and looking into this because I was frustrated, and like there's a whole bunch of research that shows that it is in fact the correct strategic decision on average for people from marginalized populations to give up on places that have turned them down,
Mm.
right? Because if you're living on a thin edge,
Mm-hmm.
you can't afford to send 20 stories to a place that's going to just keep rejecting you, right? You need to say like, oh, this place is not interested in stuff from people like me. Or my kinds of stories or whatever else. Let me go on to the
I mean,
next place. So there,
I just want to relativize that statement. It is a rational decision. That is a rational decision. I don't actually. I think it's a little bit much to say you can't afford to, particularly if there's no fee to submit. And I'm a little worried that. I mean, there's a danger in either direction, right? There's a danger of saying these people are being silly, but
so
no,
there,
they're
so you
making
can't
a rational
you
decision
can't afford to in terms of time and
emotionally.
energy, and no, when
Yeah.
time is money,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I actually think that's really critical. So there may not be like an actual money cost in terms of submission, although there used to be. We used to have to buy international reply coupon stamps to like submit things, right? And of course, in the poetry world, there are reading fees
Mm-hmm.
and so
Mm-hmm.
on. So there, for
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
things, there
Readings and
are
contests
in
is
fact
a different thing. But
right. So, but the even if you put aside the emotional effect of the rejections because you've gamified it and whatever and taken that out of the equation or whatever, but the sheer time, and the time has been reduced by being able to upload digitally and so on. But like I have a story right now that was rejected 2 months ago, 6 months ago, something. I should have turned around and sent it out again right away. I had to go like look something up first about like who the current editor
mm-hmm.
was. And as a result, it's been sitting
Yeah.
for months,
Yeah.
right? Because, there's all of these like little tiny increments of time. And so yes, it's not necessarily the correct decision,
Mm-hmm.
but it is in the world of
Yeah.
publishing short fiction, but generally it is a very rational decision to kind of run a min-max thing and be like, well, this is not a good place to put
Mm-hmm.
my time and energy.
Yeah.
They're probably going to turn me down.
And also,
That's
there's
of
the
course
broader social context, which is that if you are a person, if you are a member of a marginalized group, and some unknown number of people hate you irrationally for no reason, or whatever, don't take you
right.
seriously, whatever it is, then
Yeah.
like obviously that is like part of what you're doing is assessing whether that's the case, right? Like, so it's
Yeah,
that means it's obviously
exactly.
more likely that
And
you should cut your losses.
right, exactly. So, and a bunch of the time it will be the case, and you don't know how much,
Right.
right? And you
Exactly.
try and, so you're trying to like game that. So, I mean, we always tell people, that persistent as an editor, as a teacher, whatever, try and put that aside, essentially, right? At least to some extent, like devalue that in your
Internal
submission
calculation.
equations, right? Yeah, in your calculations, because persistence is so relevant, especially if you've been getting signals that they are interested in your work.
Yeah.
If they've
Yeah.
sent you the encouraging rejection,
Yeah.
take that seriously. That actually means a lot, right? Like if
Yeah.
they bothered to write you a real sentence, that is a sign of
Right.
intense
Right.
interest. And like that's like hard for a newbie to
Mhm.
maybe understand and
The
take into
scale.
account.
Yeah, it's hard to
So
understand the scale,
yeah,
that if they're writing you a personal
right,
rejection, that's already
right.
a pretty
And
big
so like
success in terms of
you
how
know,
many things they're getting.
so I wonder, like now listening to our two stories, and I'm thinking about like where I was, right? I was when I set out to be a writer, right, which we hadn't even really quite gotten to yet, but it was coming out of an English program, not having gotten into grad school, being rejected from all the PhD programs I'd applied to, getting a backup job as a secretary, but in fact, after a summer of being out of work and like dodging my landlord in the streets because I didn't have the rent money and eating ramen, right? Like, because that's all I could afford. So I was very broke for quite a while. And then when I started, and only because I could type fast, was able to get some temp secretarial work, and then started approaching it seriously. But it really was like I didn't have a backup job as a programmer, right? Like, for the last 25 years,
Yeah.
it's all been like, can I make writing something that is that will actually economically support at least me, if not my family, and now more recently my family, right? Like, after getting the MFA and the PhD and getting the academic job, like that was a big turning point, because it was like, okay, at this point, assuming I keep my job,
Mm-hmm.
I can teach. Even if I never publish again, they'll be mad at me,
Yeah.
but they probably won't fire me.
Yeah.
And Kevin could lose his job. We'd have to, sell this house and move into a much smaller place, but I could support the family on this for the rest of my life, right? Like, so that was
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, a shift in writing stability. But
Yeah.
up until that point, it was really very much a month to month,
Mm-hmm.
you know, putting too much on the credit cards. My credit was wrecked, etc. Like, my finances were a disaster. And so I had a lot at stake.
Yeah.
And I really did feel like I needed to maximize my chances of publication,
Mm-hmm.
make as much money as I could from writing as quickly as possible. And
Mm-hmm.
all of that was sort of warring with my artistic
Mm-hmm.
um, aspirations, right? And, I didn't go off and just try my hardest to become a commercial writer.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I should have, but, like, because I was juggling both of those things. But that, I think, put me in a very different emotion. And I was a brown bi woman, right, writing mostly about that and wondering how much that was affecting publications, for good or ill,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it was always part of the calculation, and that's it seems like a very different place than where you were standing,
Sure.
right? And it makes me wonder a little bit, like, if you hadn't had the programming thing to fall back on, would you, instead of your first novel coming out this fall,
Oh,
when
right.
you are,
Well, I've often thought that. I mean, and there's this
yeah,
really
right?
interesting decision point in my life, like bifurcation point in my story of my life, where I told my dad when I was going off to college, well, I'm going to major in writing. And he was like,
Hmm.
if you major in writing, you will, be working at something. You're not going to make it immediately, so you'll be working at some job that doesn't pay very much, and you'll have less time to write. Whereas if you like programming computers, if you major in programming computers, you can spend fewer hours doing that and more hours writing. Which at the time I was like, well, that's sensible. And I don't know. I honestly, like, it turned, given what a disaster my participation in the creative writing at program at university was, that may have saved me, because if I was economically dependent on it, I might have just ended up being a bitter asshole. On the other hand, because I was turning into a bitter asshole. On the other hand, I often think, like, is that why I have been so unproductive? Like, I often am like, why, like, it's a little bit of a, you know what I mean? Like,
My 13-year-old wants to be an artist, right? Like, she loves art, she will do it and like lose herself in it. And she also is good at arguing,
yeah,
and she's pretty smart. And I constantly think about, like, should I be advising her to go to law school and like do art on the
yeah,
side, or should I just advise her to go for it?
yeah,
And
yeah.
I don't know what the answer is. I don't, like,
Yeah, I also don't
like,
think it's a
but
binary in some ways, but in some ways it feels like it was for
no,
me
it
in
is.
some ways.
Well, it is a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Oh,
if you
law
give
school's a
yourself
binary.
over to it,
Law
yeah,
school.
right? Like, if you spend, like,
Yeah,
when I decided to do the MFA and spend 2 years immersed
yeah,
in creative
sure,
writing, and then again the PhD and spend 4 to 5 years immersed in it,
sure.
then that's a, I don't know, that's
Yeah,
like a
but when I
hardcore
say
thing.
it's
Even
not a
even
binary,
writing,
I mean those are, a PhD in creative writing and a law school degree are pretty extreme, big commitments.
yeah,
But also, people are making moment by moment decisions about how much
yeah,
to temp and how
right.
much to write or whatever. But
Right.
I
And if
do,
she wants to, like, put off college for a year
yeah,
and go off to Europe
yeah.
and do art,
Yeah,
we're probably gonna be
sure.
okay with that,
Yeah,
right?
I think in
So,
some ways it's good not to see these things as, like, obviously some decisions are big lumps like law school, but like some things are, it's good not to see it as a big catastrophic binary, like, am I going to be an artist or not? Because there are many paths, right? And, like, you know,
yeah.
I think that I do have one concrete suggestion, which I've talked to people before about this. I mean, I'm very, this thing we were talking about marginalized people getting discouraged, I think is a very important point. And I have a concrete, I think it's sort of cruel in some ways to say, if you are naturally, or if you are due to the context and social pressures going to be, um, you know, particularly discouraged, or it's going to be particularly a bad idea for you to keep bludgeoning yourself at the system. In that sense, I think while I like my like little spreadsheet of like submit it, put it in the next envelope and send it off and give yourself a point, I think it may be cruel to expect people of that. But I do have a further hack, which I think is designed for that situation, which is that the advice I give to people who are like in that, who are going to be tempted to abandon, uh, or to believe these people are going to reject me, are going to see rejections as more permanent and abandon submitting. You're the women who were only sending 2 and to try to get them to send 8 like the guys were.
Mm-hmm.
And my suggestion is to buddy up. My suggestion is to do it in
Mm-hmm.
community, because it is
Yeah.
actually very much easier for your buddy to see, even if you and your buddy share the same
Yeah.
characteristics. Your buddy is not going to be like, oh, this rejection means that I should never send it. They're just going to, what you do is you talk to your buddy about like what your optimal list is, like what are places that respond fast, pay well, or whatever the criteria are. Like, these are the ones I'd like to do. This is how long I'm willing to wait for what. Like, figure that out rationally.
Mm-hmm.
And then but then instead of allowing yourself to have the big emotional reaction, like at the beginning of your career, before you have an agent or an assistant or whatever, like, you just find a buddy and the two of you submit each other, or have submission parties. They've been doing that sometimes at cons or at, you know what I mean? But actually submitting each
Yeah.
other's stuff and just empower your friend to like send it off to the next place on the list.
Yeah.
That I think can be really effective in breaking that cycle of like, because if every time you receive a rejection, imposter syndrome is going to be waiting to pounce.
Yeah.
The best thing is to just swap, I mean, again, that also requires extroversion or having a buddy or whatever. I mean, obviously there's resource
Right.
constraints there too, but I think that can be a
No,
practical
but I think
suggestion for
I think
avoiding.
no, I think that's good. I like that a lot. I think, and I want to. I think we should start wrapping up
Yeah, we
because
need
it's
to
been
wrap up.
almost
Yeah.
2 hours. But I think one thing that I want to go back and say, like, I targeted to some extent, where I thought I had a good chance of getting published. I mean, these days, in fact, like, I'm now at a point where I mostly am only writing work that's solicited. So, in fact, I know in advance
Sure.
that they're going to publish it,
Right.
which is a very different space.
Yeah.
But back in the day, the like, I I could sit here and think like, oh, that Fleeing God story that I sent to Circlet Press. Maybe if I'd sent it to the New Yorker, they would have thought it was funny and published it. Like, it's not impossible.
Yeah.
But um, aside from the quality question, which I agree is like, it's a little hard to really judge that, I do kind of want to point back to the sheer volume.
Sure.
And I think that's part of what goes into targeting for me.
Sure.
So I wanted to just put that out there. Like, the fact that the New Yorker, and we say that one a lot, but the Atlantic, Harper's, etc., the fact that they get tens of thousands of submissions a month, right, just means that your chances are
Sure.
much lower. They're just like flat out much lower. And so
Yeah.
even if you put aside questions of quality, sending it to an anthology which is going to get 100 submissions and has 30 slots to fill,
Yeah.
you have a much better chance there,
Sure.
right? So
No, absolutely, and
so there's
I agree. I don't want to. I think that it should. I think you ought to ideally sit down and think about some kind of calculation of like probability based just on the numbers game, how proud you would be to see yourself in those particular pages. Sometimes I think about like the quality of the Quarterly West is a small thing, but that's a really high quality. Like, that's a beautiful
was.
piece of.
We
It's
did
a
a good job
beautiful
with
actual
it.
magazine.
Yeah.
Like, it's a physically beautiful
Yeah.
thing. Like, or McSweeney's. Like, those are amazing objects. Like, that's like whatever the satisfaction is, or whatever the also being connected to a community. Like sometimes I will. I mean, I have the stories that I have sold for the least are because it was Tim and Heather, or it was,
Yeah.
Gavin and
No, and
Kelly.
I'll
Like,
give, and I also give away stories
yeah,
for charity events
right.
and whatever else, right? So, but I think also the sorry, what was I going to say? Something. Also, I guess I didn't put in the other factor, which is how good I think this story is for me,
Mhm.
right? Like everyone's, so I don't know if you have this experience, but when I write stories and they go through the workshopping process and whatever, like they get to, when I'm ready to submit them, it's at a place where I'm like, okay, I think this is a good
Yeah.
story. I think this is worthwhile to put out in the world, etc. And and I think people will like it, my whatever. Every once in a while, I write something that is like a cut above,
Mhm.
right? It is
Yeah.
clearly, notably better
Hmm.
than the stuff that I write normally. And whether we're going to have the muses inspiring me or
Mhm.
whatever it
Mhm.
is, like
Yep.
my unconscious has been working extra hard, those stories I will start at the top,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
well, they may
Depends
or
on the
may not
story.
see
Yeah.
the brilliance here, but
But I do.
I think
Right.
it's pretty
Right.
good,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's not the same calculation for every piece of work
Right.
either, is I
Right.
guess what I'm
Yeah, no,
trying to say,
exactly.
right?
For the, I feel like you should just sort of, whether it's like a spreadsheet or more intuitive, like, but just sort of on some level in your head multiply all those things together. Like, given this story, what is its, what are its shots and what are its, and I think also that batching. I do agree that there is a time cost to being like, oh, and what's the editor's name and what do I do? Just switching modes. But some of that, um, pre-deciding in a batch, like these are the
Yeah.
20 markets I'm going to send this story to, and I've got, what I mean, like I'm just making a list of them.
Yeah, no.
It does
I
mean
have
that,
a set of 10
yeah, it
that I
does
go
mean that
down, yeah.
turnaround time can be very, and other considerations, like how many people see it. I mean, one thing that is interesting for me is, like, I just said I like the physical object sometimes, but also things being online is a huge win because then
Hugely
people can link
valuable,
to
yeah.
them, and and that's a whole
Yeah.
different economy. Also, like whether this market precludes later reprints, or how many people.
Mhm.
There's a lot, all those calculations that go into it, but ultimately. Yeah, I completely. For each story is going to have
And
its
I
own
think
unique.
and if people are listening to this and you're like, well,
That
I
sounds like
live
too
in
much work.
Kuala Lumpur and I
Yeah,
have no idea about any of this.
yeah,
I mean, this is why finding an online
yeah.
community of writers who can, like look at your work, you look at their work, but like if you find some people who do know the landscape,
Yeah,
the publishing landscape, and that will be tremendously helpful,
yeah.
right? So we've started, for example, a Facebook group for South Asian science fiction fantasy writers, Yudhanjaya Vijayaratne and I, and sorry, a couple other people, names I'm blanking right now, moderate it. And it's fairly new and low volume, but like,
Hmm.
the idea is that we can share resource info. People tell us like, oh, I've sold a story to here. And that then gives you information. It tells you like, A, the market exists. B, they're open to work from South
Hmm.
Asian writers featuring South Asian characters. Like that's incredibly useful to
Yeah,
know, right?
and there's
So
often those spaces often become like, it was interesting that like onlinewritingworkshop.com was like a thing at the when I was starting, and like a
mhm,
whole bunch of like writers who I later, sort of. I mean, I've not been back there in a long time, but like I know a lot of people from that era where that was a place to find other writers and critique each other's stories, and there's that kind of thing at any given era. There's also a lot of sites. I mean, again, navigating this is difficult, but there's things like the Submission Grinder, which is a
mhm,
free site where you could search on word count and genre, and it's very easy to come up with, sorted by pay rate or whatever. Um,
mhm.
Things like that. I think if you sign up for an account there, that will like track your submissions too and stuff. I just use a spiral bound notebook to do
You're
it.
right.
But you know what I mean. Like that's there are we could probably find some things to link in the show notes, that there are resources to navigate that. You also don't have to get it perfect, but I think on some
Yeah,
level, um, yeah, the it's some kind of calculation like that you're
yeah.
making.
Anyway, all right. Final. I actually think we should pick this up in another episode because we've gotten to like
This is the
we've
this is
sort of
the
like
early
this is how
phase.
we got this is how we got to like starting to send out stuff. And I think it would be interesting to like pick up with like, okay, so we've started selling some stories, like what happened next,
Yeah,
and go
yeah,
from
yeah,
there.
yeah.
Um,
Part two.
but part two, and or possibly this was an hour long, so we may end up
Parts two
breaking
and
this up
three.
into like part. Yes, exactly. This may be three segments
Yeah,
already, but regardless,
yeah,
um, the I guess I want to my takeaway from this, I guess, is that uh, I don't want people to be overwhelmed by how many factors and so on
sure.
we've thrown out there, and that the main barrier, I think, really, I think really is the rejection barrier, in the sense of like, whether you're self-rejecting or being rejected by other people, but figuring out like, where are you getting stopped in the process of sending things out, and letting editors see them.
Yeah, or however
right?
you share them, because I mean, as we said, that's sort of
Yes.
the professional submission to magazines is just one thing. What I mean, whether
Right.
it could be that you just, another thing to do is just stay on AO3 for a long time, because I don't know,
Right.
were you there at the Hugos when Archive of
I
Our
was.
Own won an award, and they said, can everyone who considers themselves a part of this community stand up? And like half the room stood up
It
at
was
the Hugos.
amazing.
Like, so yeah,
Yeah.
like that's another way that you could get nourishment and connection and whatever. If you don't need the money to make rent initially, like that's
Right.
a great place to hone your craft. Anyway, I think ultimately what you're trying to do is figure out how for you can most efficiently create a virtuous cycle where when you send something out, it's coming back. And even though the odds are against your placing everything you sell necessarily in a pro magazine, nonetheless, like you're feeling like I'm getting closer, I'm getting better, I'm learning. That's the best. That's the
I'm going to take off
optimal
my
situation.
headset for a second because I want to grab something. Wait, no, don't go. Hold on.
I gotta go let Esther. You're grabbing something.
Okay.
Oh, is that the...
I wanted to end this with showing you my box. So here's my box, and the box is crammed full of stuff because there was a year early on in writing when I had stories I was putting up on my website, and I put my address on there, and I asked people to send me a postcard if they liked a story.
That's awesome.
This is from that year.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
This is like my touchstone, right? Because I have in here, every once in a while I'll pull it out and look at it, and I keep thinking I should make like an art piece out of it or something. But like, there's a letter in here from someone who said that one of the erotica stories I wrote saved his marriage.
Wow.
There's postcards from soldiers during Desert Storm who were finding my stuff on the internet. There's one from a scientist at the Antarctic station who's reading my stuff. And like, so thinking about what fuels you and like, the days when I'm like super depressed about like a rejection, or I'm not writing as well as I would like to be, it's never going to be the great art I want it to be. I'm like, but I saved a marriage.
Yeah.
That's worth something, right?
And on that note.
On that note. So, all right. Bye, guys.
Bye.